The most diabolical human experiments ever performed. The child and the ape experiment. Have you ever seen those cute videos of, new families, a young couple and they have a baby and they have a puppy and the puppy and the baby are playing together? Yeah, the ape and the child experiment is basically the worst possible version of that. This experiment takes place in 1931. It was conducted by a young couple, Winthrop and Luella Kellogg, and they recently just had a baby boy named Donald. And when Donald turned 10 months old, he had another sibling, not a brother, but a sister. However, this sister was not biological or even related by species. This sister that he was given was a 7-month-old chimpanzee named Gua. Winthrop Kellogg was a psychologist who specifically worked on the psychology of animals, primarily dolphins, rats, and birds. And him and his wife decided that it would be best to take their work home and to up the ante by not only experimenting with a chimpanzee, but also by effect their own child. The couple planned on documenting this entire experiment that they were about to begin. And the specific point of this experiment was to study the environmental influence upon early behavior, which what that really meant was they wanted to see if they raised a baby and an ape the exact same way at the exact same time, if they could get a similar outcome. And you can probably already see where this is going. It's speculated that they initially thought that this experiment would be relatively harmless and that their child would simply be a baseline to refer to when it comes to early education. And only the chimpanzee would be tested on because only the chimpanzee was being treated differently, right? The child hanging out with the chimpanzee wasn't going to be affected by this. Well, I won't spoil it, but it wasn't fully accurate. Interestingly, the Kellogg's thought they were doing the moral thing because initially they actually wanted to test the opposite. They wanted to see what the effects of having a child grow up in the wild would be. But because it's extremely dangerous and unethical to leave a baby in the woods, they were like, oh, well, why don't we just take an animal and put it in a human condition to see exactly how smart a chimpanzee can be and what their true natural potential would be if they were raised as a human. When you put it in that perspective, it may almost kind of seem logical, right? Regardless, after Donald and Gua were introduced, the tests began. And over the next 9 months, there was full-time grueling tests taking place between Gua and Donald to see exactly how a baby chimp and a baby human would compare and develop as they were both being treated the exact same as a normal baby would. Although, was Donald really being treated like a normal baby? They likely never had the time to ask that question because over these 9 months, there were so many experiments, tests, practices. There was literally no time to think about anything besides the daily tasks. Winthrop, during this time, literally took a leave of absence from his job to focus on this experiment full time and even moved his family down to Florida to be closer to the university where he had gotten this chimp and where he would be submitting his research. Now, after 9 months of daily testing and analysis, the experiment was mysteriously stopped. And while almost every aspect of this experiment was relatively well documented, the reason for why it stopped was not, which led to a bit of speculation. One primary belief is that they ended the experiment due to the rapid growth of Gua compared to Donald. Obviously, animals develop a lot faster than humans do, and in 9 months, Gua could have doubled or tripled in size, making her possibly dangerous to baby Donald. However, another leading theory is due to the fact that Donald was picking up more chimpanzee tendencies than the Kellogg's would have liked. And this is supported by some of the documents that the Kellogg's made. They even admitted near the end of the test that Donald was behind when it came to communication, and really only had a very small vocabulary of words and wasn't babbling much, and typically would only mimic the noises that Gua would make. Regardless of the reason, after 9 months, the experiment was closed. And while the experiment was well documented and completed at this point, the story doesn't end there. Because unfortunately, only a year after Gua was returned to the facility that she was taken from, she passed away from pneumonia. And Donald, on the other hand, was reported to have suffered from social and emotional issues through his young and adult life, and even ended up taking his own life at the age of 43. At this point, with the experiment basically being almost 100 years old, it's kind of up to speculation to try to understand if the parents knew that Donald would simply be a control for this test that they were doing, or if they knew that this experiment could potentially have detrimental side effects to their own child. But regardless, it happened, and now we know the consequences. And unsurprisingly, the ethics of this experiment were widely criticized, specifically because they used their own human child in such a strange and long-lasting experiment. And while some of the findings from this experiment did end up becoming useful in scientific research of animals and humans, one has to ask themselves, is it worth experimenting on your own child? Is it worth experimenting on any human? Is it worth experimenting on animals? That's a question I'll leave to you. Regardless, the child and the ape experiment is rather unfortunate. And if you can believe it, this is the most tame human experiment we're going to discuss in this list. They only get worse from here, and we're only just getting started. Let's move on. The little Albert experiment. In the first experiment, we discussed a child who was not given the proper opportunity to develop like a normal child should, and unfortunately, they became a victim of that. Although in this experiment, we do discuss another child, however, they weren't just not given the opportunity to develop, they were forced to develop negative connections in their brain. Not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but this is literally a Pavlov experiment that took place on children, not dogs. Let me explain. The little Albert experiment was conducted by John B. Watson and Rosalie Rayner and took place in 1920. And the point of the little Albert experiment was to see if they could condition children to fear something that would typically not provoke fear. Already off to a great start. Watson famously claimed that if he was given 12 newborn children, he could condition them in their upbringing to turn them into any sort of person you could desire. A lawyer, a doctor, a murderer. Anything you wanted a person to be, you could condition them to become that during their early years. I definitely do not think we should be giving John B. Watson any children. Regardless, in the 1920s, somebody did. Watson was able to get his hands on a 9-month-old baby, known as Albert, for his experiment. Watson planned on using classical conditioning methods, also known as Pavlovian conditioning, because it was the same method that Pavlov used to condition dogs. The experiment began with little Albert being placed in a room. Watson, his partner, and a rat were all in this room together, and Watson and his partner simply watched how Albert and the rat would interact. At first, they weren't interested in each other until Albert decided to reach out and touch the white lab rat. It was at that point when Rosalie would strike a metal bar with a hammer, making a loud and scary noise, which would obviously upset Albert. And they would continue to do this time after time in this room every time Albert decided to reach out to the lab rat, until the point where Albert wanted nothing to do with this lab rat. Albert had associated this lab rat with a scary, unpleasant experience. And because of that, this lab rat that he was curious about, he was now afraid of. And not only now was this little Albert afraid of mice, but his fear began to become generalized. They learned this because after the experiment, when they handed Albert a teddy bear, Albert also rejected and gave the same reaction to this fluffy teddy bear that he did to the mouse. And it was theorized that at that point, it wasn't only the mouse that was triggering this negative reaction, but it was any fuzzy object that resembled the white mouse to this baby. Some examples were a white teddy bear, a white rabbit, a small dog, and even a Santa Claus mask. Fortunately, this specific experiment only had one victim, and that was little Albert. There was no control subjects, and the study basically ended there and the paper was published. And while that alone has obvious ethical flaws, once again, the story does not end there. Because Watson was now able to prove that he could condition a child, so what did he do next? Well, naturally, he decided to condition his own children. But he didn't condition his children for fear, but he did have some very interesting parenting philosophies. One of his most popular parenting philosophies was the thought that children should not be given too much attention. Watson believed that you should limit the amount of affection you showed your children. That meant during the day, limiting hugs, no kisses, minimal affirmation, and minimal attention. He literally said that you shouldn't play with your kids because it would disrupt their routine, as if children have routines. He also was a big proponent of sleep training, basically just letting your baby lay in the crib until it cries itself to sleep. Watson believed in all of this, and because he believed this and believed it to be good, he used all of these strategies on his 4 children that he had. Keep in mind, Watson claimed that if he was given newborn children, he could turn them into anything he wanted. So what do you think ended up happening to his 4 children? Let me tell you. Watson's son John suffered from unexplainable migraines and died in his early 50s. His daughter Mary struggled with alcohol abuse almost all of her adult life and attempted to take her life multiple times. Watson's other son James also attempted to take his life, and Watson's 4th child William did take his own life. Candidly, I'm not a parent, but I think it's safe to assume, based off this example and possible common sense, providing your children with a safe, loving environment is likely ideal for them to be raised into happy, healthy people. But what do I know? If you're a parent and you're watching this, let me know your thoughts on this experiment in the comments below. Regardless, the true identity of little Albert was never disclosed. It's unknown whether or not the parents of little Albert knew about the experiment. The long-term effects of this experiment that took place on little Albert are unknown and unfortunately are likely not good based off of the evidence we've seen. And Watson not only unsuccessfully raised his own children, but also influenced an entire generation on how to raise their children, which likely had an interesting impact on society. I think it's important to know that near the end of his life, Watson became rather reclusive and began to denounce a lot of his previous work, stating that he should have not made the books he did or made the claims that he had simply because he didn't have the knowledge yet. And it's even reported that he burned a lot of the physical copies of his experiments that he had in his personal study. You always want to assume the best in people, and maybe Watson just thought that if you gave your your children too much affection, they would simply be attention-seeking, unhappy people. And for that reason, if that is truly the case, then it's unfortunate that he made such a detrimental mistake with those that likely meant the most to him. Although there is a very likely possibility that this person simply didn't care about the well-being of people and only wanted the scientific answer he was looking for. I know these entries were a bit similar, and for that reason, I wanted to put them together. Truthfully, I couldn't pick just one to add, so I decided to add both. And because this video gets darker and darker, they obviously had to go side by side. And if you're done hearing about childhood experiments, then buckle up, because this video is about to take a very dark turn. The Aversion Project. If you've watched our first video we made about conspiracy theories, then you'd probably remember me talking about the Canadian gaydar, which was essentially tests that the Canadian government developed to ensure that nobody in the military or police was gay, because if they were, then they were being fired. The Aversion Project was kind of like that, but only unthinkably worse. Like much, much, much worse. The Aversion Project took place in South Africa during the 1970s and 1980s, under the apartheid regime. This entire project was led by Dr. Aubrey Levin, who was a military psychiatrist. And under his control, this entire project was actually carried out by the South African Defense Force, a massive military institution in South Africa. And in the South African military, there was actually a dual policy, which essentially stated that permanent members of the military were not able to be homosexual. You couldn't be gay if you were gonna stay. However, conscripts and temporary members of the military were allowed to be gay. But this isn't because they were a kind and tolerant bunch. The primary reason why this dual policy existed is because the South African military wanted to make sure that nobody was using homosexuality as an excuse to not join the army, which would have likely been very common because at the time, all white men in South Africa were required to serve a certain amount of years in the military. And the government thought if they banned homosexuality, obviously, then all these white men would just be claiming they're gay. Now here's the thing, it doesn't end there. The South African military might have allowed temporary members of the military to, join, as they were legally required to, but another thing they had to do if they were a temporary member of the military who was homosexual is they had to endure forced therapy. And of course, this wasn't talk therapy or to help people suffering from PTSD in the military. This was forced aversion therapy with electric shocks, castration, and even gender reassignment surgeries. The project's ultimate goal was to cure these homosexual military members while they were a member of the military and basically at the will of the military. And because of that, they forced them through psychological torture and medical procedures that they did not want to have done. And on top of this, they didn't just do this to people that admitted they were homosexual. They did this to people that they assumed were homosexual. Meaning that if you were a member of the military at this time, and people thought that you were being a bit fruity, or if people just didn't like you and wanted a good excuse to literally torture you, they would accuse you of being gay. And at that point, you could be subject to a laundry list of horrific experiments. Some of the most common things that were done were strapping down these alleged homosexuals and showing them homosexual images. Obviously, it doesn't end there. As they would show these victims homosexual images, they would then electrically shock the victim to try to create a negative connection in the brain towards same-sex relationships, which kind of ties into the Little Albert experiment. Which, on top of this shock therapy, some soldiers were chemically castrated by being given a concoction of chemicals that the doctors believed could potentially cure homosexuality, or at least all of their evil urges. And one less popular thing they did that still happened was forced gender reassignment surgeries, where these members of the military were literally subject to hormonal treatments and genital surgeries that would alter their sex against their will, which is disturbing and evil and almost ironic because they're like, okay, we're gonna take all of the gay people of the military, so we're gonna make them trans. Literally just insane. And it's estimated that anywhere from 500 to 1,000 young men and women were subject to these brutal procedures at the hands of the Aversion Project over the course of the apartheid. It's hard to imagine the sheer terror and agony that was likely being experienced by the victims at this time, but it's even harder to imagine the long-term effects of this essentially torture that took place on these people. There's no doubt that many of the victims that suffered this severe psychological and physical trauma had the rest of their lives altered forever. And specifically for the people that had their genitals mutilated unconsensually, for the percentage of those who survived the surgery, many of them went on to take their own life not long after. The apartheid ended in the 1990s, and the truly disturbing details of the Aversion Project came to light. And Dr. Levin knew he was about to be in big trouble, so he left South Africa and fled to Canada, where he, disturbingly, was able to continue his medical practice. That was until he ironically was convicted of multiple sexual assaults on men. That's right, this person who had been mutilating homosexual and suspected homosexual men and women in South Africa himself was accused by over 30 men of sexual assault. And it was only at that point, after Levin was tried, that he was sentenced to 5 years, which he had already served and he's actually free again, and had his medical license suspended. This story and series of human experiments is truly diabolical. And on top of all of the pain and suffering and discrimination that took place in the South African military, it's almost mind-boggling to me that if Levin didn't assault people in Canada, he would be a free man, and that he served no time or had no legal repercussion for what he did in South Africa. However, I suppose logically it makes sense because in South Africa, what they were doing was legal. That was the law. If you were gay, you had to go to the military and you had to be cured, or at least treated. So crazy. But at least the story has a bit of a happy ending because evil people are gonna be evil. And while Levin had a get out of jail free card by going back to Canada, he couldn't go at least a few days without hurting other people. 5 years for over 30 assaults of literal medical patients is not enough in my opinion. The Aversion Project is truly a dark chapter in medical and human rights history. And to this day, the story is a huge reminder of what's possible when you have unchecked power, non-existent morals, and state-backed medical abuse. Before we get to the final entry of this video, I wanted to list a few honorable mentions, or I suppose dishonorable mentions. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment was a truly diabolical human experiment, and if you want to learn about that, I actually talked about it in this video about American conspiracy theories. The monster study of 1939, I actually talked about in my first video about human experiments, and the Unit 731 experiment is likely one of the most diabolical human experiments to ever take place. And the only reason why it's not in this video is because I also talked about it in my last video. So I just wanted to address these quickly. Obviously, these are all diabolical human experiments. I'm just not talking about them in this video because I've already mentioned them in other videos. And while we're at it, I just want to say this as well. If you guys enjoyed this video about diabolical human experiments and want more, please let me know in the comments below. Your guys' support is always appreciated, and your feedback is always taken into consideration. But truthfully, I'm just procrastinating at this point because this final entry on the list is literally beyond diabolical. But I suppose let's just rip off the band-aid now. The Nazi medical experiments. This experiment isn't one experiment. It's an entire series of experiments that took place during World War II. And these Nazi medical experiments were carried out in concentration camps under the direction of high-ranking Nazi doctors, primarily Joseph Mengele, who was later known as the Angel of Death. There's a reason why I put this one last. It's important to note that Joseph Mengele was not the only doctor committing these atrocities we're about to get into. There was over a dozen doctors committing horrible human rights violations, and doing so in the name of science, but as you'll see, it's quite far from the truth. Joseph Mengele and the other Nazi doctors performed their experiments on prisoners in the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp, which primarily housed Jewish and Romani people. And because the people in these camps were not even seen as humans, to the Nazis, they were essentially less than cattle, and the fact that they were coming in by the trainload every day meant that these doctors had an unlimited supply of research subjects that they could do anything they wanted to. And they took full advantage of this cruel, horrific opportunity. The reasons for these experiments varied greatly, from experimenting on people for the benefit of the military, all the way to personal leisure or interest. There was literally hundreds, if not thousands, of different experiments that were performed on these people by the Nazis to gain random pieces of knowledge. I literally can't explain every single one of them, although I will give a few examples of some of the things they did. One disturbing experiment that the Nazi Party did was they would take someone and then put them into a pressure chamber. A chamber that they could either add air pressure to or remove air pressure from to simulate altitude. And what they would do with these victims in the chamber is raise and drop the pressure significantly multiple times. And the reason they were doing this is to see the effects on the human body of quick altitude changes to further their research on what happens when people jump out of planes. Obviously an advantageous military strategy. The experience for the victim inside the chamber had to be horrific. And unfortunately, after cycles of high and low pressure, the doctors would then take these victims and autopsy them while they were still alive, because they wanted to monitor every part of the body while the heart was still beating. They did this one specific diabolical experiment to over 200 people, 80 of which died during the experiment, and the other 120 that survived were executed immediately after. Another disturbing human experiment that Nazis would do involved hyperthermia. They wanted to better understand how it worked and how to prevent it. And how they went about this was by subjecting people to intense conditions. For some examples, they would put people naked into freezing water, monitoring their vitals until they died of hypothermia. Other examples, they would put people in Nazi uniforms and then put them into cold water to see how effective the Nazi uniforms were at preventing hypothermia. And in some cases, they would put people naked in freezing conditions for up to 14 hours to see what would happen to these people. And for those who did survive the intense cold conditions, they would rewarm these people and then subject them to crazy conditions once again. And how they would rewarm these people varied from heat lamps to boiling water. Similar to the Unit 731 experiment, they also tested diseases, specifically injecting deadly diseases into people to see how they would affect them, and also performing live autopsies on these people so they could see the effects of the disease in real time. Almost all of the surgeries and experiments that were performed by the Nazis were performed without anesthesia, meaning that these victims felt almost every grueling detail of what was happening to them, whether it be a live autopsy or being boiled alive or having an experimental sterilization take place on your genitals. I think you get the point, but these Nazi medical experiments were insane. Joseph Mengele personally conducted experiments specifically on twins too, with some of the more common experiments having the goal of either changing eye colors or conjoining siblings by simply removing limbs and trying to connect the two people together. Like I said, I would need probably a multi-day long video to go through the entire list of crazy experiments that took place, but at the end of the day, the total goal of all of these Nazi medical experiments lined up basically with the Nazis' radical ideologies that they had. And the purpose of these experiments was to simply improve the survival chances of German soldiers at war and to find the most effective way to sterilize or exterminate people that weren't Aryan. I could go deeper into excruciating detail, but I truly think you get the idea. The experiments performed by these Nazi medical doctors were so detrimental and so well known that it forced these doctors to be tried during the Nuremberg trials, which individually varied in level of consequences, but in general led to a much stricter medical standard, including the Nuremberg Code, which is essentially a set of ethical principles that must be followed when conducting human experimentation. The Nazi medical experiments were almost unspeakably disturbing, and I can only imagine the acts that didn't make it to the history books. And these human experiments that took place by the Nazis are likely only rivaled by the Unit 731 experiment for some of the most diabolical human experiments of all time. And for that reason, I knew I had to discuss it on this video. This video went from strange to upsetting to disgusting to disturbing extremely quick. But don't say I didn't warn you. It's almost mind-boggling the lengths that people are willing to go to in the name of scientific discovery. And while that almost may sound noble out of context, I think that this video, if nothing else, proved that there is a line and rules need to be enforced. The scariest cults from around the world. Imagine you're standing on the street just minding your own business when you get approached by a couple and they have some important information for you. They tell you that they are spiritual guides and they can help take you to a next level of existence beyond Earth and human comprehension. They say that you can transcend humanity by transforming into an immortal extraterrestrial being. It sounds like an interesting proposal. So you take a flyer and attend a meeting. And at this point, you can go either one of two ways. Your suspicions are either confirmed and you realize that you spoke to crazy people, or you believed you talked to some of the most important people ever, and in that instance, you just joined a cult. This cult is known as Heaven's Gate, and it was an American cult founded in 1974 by Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles, who, like I mentioned, saw themselves as spiritual guides to a next level of human existence. Without spoiling the ending, Heaven's Gate is most commonly known for its mass suicides committed by its members, but the story goes a lot deeper than just the headlines. Nettles and Applewhite first met in 1972 and went on a journey of spiritual discovery together, and came out on the other side identifying themselves as two witnesses of Revelation, or the Book of Apocalypse in the Bible. This claim alone, and some clever convincing, was reason enough for them to start attracting hundreds of people to start at least paying attention to their movement in the mid-70s. And after a few years, they even had over a dozen members adopting a monastic lifestyle, dedicating their life to Heaven's Gate and giving up all worldly pursuits beyond this cult, which is insane. This cult is commonly recognized as a UFO religion, primarily because the central belief of this group was that the followers could transform themselves into immortal extraterrestrial beings by rejecting their human nature. By rejecting this human nature, they would by default ascend to heaven, or what they would refer to as the next level. This cult primarily grew by Applewhite and Nettles trying to contact other extraterrestrials, aka like-minded people, aka other crazy people. They took out ads and flyers to promote meetings where they would recruit disciples that they called the crew. At these events, they would purport to represent beings from another planet who were looking for patients for an experiment. That alone is already creepy. They got straight to the crazy even on sign up. There was no easing into it, it seemed. They mentioned, though, that those who agreed to take part in their experiment would be brought to a higher evolutionary level. An interesting proposal, potentially, but still, red flags are everywhere. In 1975, Applewhite and Nettles preached at a motel hall in Oregon, and following that session, over 20 people sold all of their worldly possessions and essentially disappeared off the face of the planet, not being seen by family, friends, or even the general public at all. These people didn't just disappear, but they had become a part of Heaven's Gate, which at this point had already began going underground. Applewhite and Nettles changed their name to Doe and T, and they had led nearly 100 people across the country to ditch their families and join Heaven's Gate. The lore that they came up with is deep, and it's a really weird twist on a lot of existing religious texts and theories about history. But one of the more interesting claims they made is that they believe that Jesus himself was an alien, which is an interesting take for sure. But what's more interesting is what happened in October of 1996. The group rented a large house that they called the Monastery, which was a 10,000 square foot mansion in California. At the time, they were paying $7,000 per month in rent, cash, and they even took out alien abduction insurance on each of their members, with a $1 million payout per person. Which, who the hell is selling alien abduction insurance? But that's a side point. That's a video about insurance scams, not cults. Now, this house isn't the interesting event, but it's the precursor to what really put this cult on the map. Nearly 1 year into renting the monastery, Applewhite taped a video of himself entitled Doe's Final Exit, where he spoke on mass death and how it was the only way to evacuate this earth. He was convinced that the comet Hale-Bopp was the sign that the group had been looking for, and speculated that there was a UFO following this comet. And because of this, Applewhite and 38 of his followers prepared a ritual death. This death lined up exactly with when the comet was closest to the earth, so that their souls could reach the next level. In the following days, 39 people had taken a concoction of vodka and poison, and, like you may have guessed, died. There is so much crazy and honestly disturbing lore to this cult, but I think the best way to describe it is that they believe that humans were boring, aliens were cool, and if a human wanted to become an alien, they had to die. It's amazing what people are willing to believe and dedicate and sacrifice their life for. Oh, and if the Heaven's Gate logo looks familiar, Lil Uzi Vert used it as inspiration for his album cover, which is odd. But assuming you're a semi-reasonable person, you're likely not interested or swayed by the claims of an afterlife and UFOs and being a part of the Bible from random strangers. What a reasonable person may be interested in, though, is a community that worships God, people that are like-minded in faith, a faith that at surface level seems semi-reasonable. In this instance, you may be interested in the Children of God. This name already may sound familiar, and that's because Nick Crowley, a great YouTuber, just made a video about some of the lore involved with this cult. Specifically, the TV programs this cult was producing, which was insane. It was essentially propaganda pieces for children. And spoiler alert, it was pretty disturbing. But we'll get to that. The Children of God lore is deep, and I'll do my best to summarize it as neatly as possible. The Children of God was founded by a creep named David Berg in 1968. It initially attracted young followers with the message of love, communal living, and devotion, which may sound innocent enough. But the group soon became infamous for its controversial beliefs and practices. Most of these controversial beliefs and practices started to be introduced once the cult was more established. Initially, some of their beliefs were more conservative and aligned with the Bible, although it seemed that the group's beliefs started to morph to fit Berg's personal desires, which we'll get into. For example, initially the group was rather conservative and didn't even believe in hand-holding until marriage. But once Berg had an affair with his assistant, he then started spreading messages of polygamy, which turned into what he called sharing, which we'll get into, and that gets a lot darker. Before we get too into the weeds, let's give some context. This group was founded with a core focus on an apocalyptic prophecy, where Berg was claiming that the world was set to end in 1993. And the purpose of this group was to promote love and devotion to God so that they could be saved during this apocalypse. They spread their messages through song and dedicated as much time as possible to praising God before the end times. Child members of this group were not even educated because they saw it as a waste of time because the world was ending soon anyway. So all of the children and adults in this group were simply sitting, hanging out, singing songs, waiting for the end of the world, which to me doesn't sound like a great time. But that's just me. Floor Edwards, a previous member of the Children of God, said this about the cult's mindset at the time. Quote, "For many, it was euphoric thinking about the afterlife. We earned that spot in heaven. We were the chosen ones." That's definitely a take on it. Interestingly, Berg wasn't seen very often by most of the cult members, as at its peak, the group had over 10,000 members worldwide. Although he was in consistent communication with all of his followers through what he called Mo letters. which was essentially daily propaganda pieces, where he would take Bible verses and intertwine them with his own twisted doctrine, which, like I mentioned earlier, evolved over time. These Mo letters included instructions that his followers must follow, and strangely enough, a lot of the imagery in these letters was rather graphic. We'll say that. According to ex-members of the Children of God, Mo wrote over 3,000 of these Mo letters, which is insane. But these letters weren't the only way that the Children of God was able to get their message out. Like I mentioned, Nick Crowley made a great video about the TV series that the Children of God had created and that was televised called Life with Grandpa, in which he describes the TV show essentially indoctrinating children into the values of the group and the religious beliefs that were unsavory, to say the least. To really paint the picture, there's a scene in the show where a woman is shown as a robot with literal boobs, and Grandpa, aka David Berg, was talking about how much he loves this perfect woman. And there's many episodes with young girls singing about how their purpose is to cook, clean, and take care of the men in their life. That is honestly just a tame sampling of some of the cool stuff in this cult's kid show. Of course, I'm using cool ironically. Now, going back to the concept of sharing. Without getting too graphic, essentially, Berg was promoting love with no bounds, as he claimed that Jesus created love and sex for people to enjoy, and he thought the best way to honor God was to have it without limits, which to him meant with anybody at any time, consenting or not, which also included with children, which is obviously disgusting. Former members who were children at the time said that they felt pressured to do anything with anyone because they knew if they said no that they would be punished by God and potentially not accepted into heaven when the apocalypse came, which was, in their mind, soon. This, unsurprisingly, led to widespread allegations of sexual exploitation and abuse, of course, including minors. The Children of God faced significant backlash and legal scrutiny due to the reports of emotional, psychological, and sexual abuse among members, although that wasn't quite enough to take it down fully. That was the bump in the road for the group. After David Berg died, his assistant, who he was having the affairs with, took over the group and tried rebranding the group multiple times in an attempt to distance it from its dark past. And they even tried to renounce some of their harmful practices. However, the decades of trauma experienced by former members was an inseparable part of the cult's history. And with the death of David, the rebrands, and all of the allegations, the group went from over 10,000 members worldwide to today being a small underground internet community. And I personally hope it continues to shrink to the point of nothingness very soon. I'm sure the world not ending in 1993 also had a big part to do with it. Interestingly, multiple celebrities were actually involved with this cult, notably Joaquin Phoenix and Rose McGowan. Rose McGowan described her experience as extremely stressful, like she was walking a high-wire act. She was expected to be perfect physically and was even cut with a knife by another member when she had a blemish on her finger. How Rose was involved in this group was because her father was actually the leader of the Italian branch of the Children of God. But fortunately, once the Children of God started promoting child abuse, her dad separated from the group entirely. Joaquin Phoenix and his siblings in the 1970s were also involved in the group, and even traveled through Central and South America with the group, but didn't remain members for long, as initially they thought it was a dedicated religious group, but found out that it was much deeper than that and cut ties. It's upsetting enough when individuals are tricked into joining cults and doing unspeakable things and having horrible lives, but it's just downright disheartening and depressing when they get their children involved too. Likely unsurprisingly, the Children of God had an extremely high suicide rate, with many ex-members having lifelong trauma, psychological illnesses, and at the very least, horrible, unforgettable memories. But if you're not interested in aliens, and you're not interested in any sort of religious movement, what if a man approached you and told you that he could tell you when you're going to die? This, to anybody, may seem like an interesting proposal, but the more info you start to get, the more the cracks start to show. This man referred to himself as Lou Castor and claimed that he was 1,000 years old and he was the combination of 3 different angels. He claimed that he had died and came back to life and that now he himself can predict deaths accurately, among other things. Potentially one of the biggest draws for some is that Lou claimed that if you were close to him, he could not only predict your death, but bring you back to life, which for most people sounds like a good reason to stick around. But on top of the claims of being resurrected, from a surface level, it looked like the members of this group lived a relatively lavish lifestyle. Lou had a compound in Wichita, Kansas, where he had 10 members of the group living with him. Everybody who was completely provided for with food, shelter, technology, toys, gadgets, ATVs, luxury vehicles, anything these members could want, they had, and it was all provided for by Lou. But interestingly enough, nobody knew what Lou did for work. He said he had stocks and bonds and a cattle ranch down in Texas, but nobody could directly pinpoint his wealth, and it didn't seem like anybody was extremely concerned because they were directly benefiting from it. Although it definitely came with a price. Having a 10-person commune with luxury vehicles in Wichita, Kansas definitely drew attention. But for this cult, that wasn't an issue. And Lou was an active participant in the community. He would donate to the police, have community-wide barbecues in his backyard, and even had an ATV track on his 10-acre property where anybody could come and enjoy the track. This sense of community definitely allowed people to feel a little bit more comfortable, and I think people assumed that if he had something to hide, he wouldn't be so flashy, which may seem reasonable, but you could also say this is more or less of a John Wayne Gacy approach. But here's the thing. Behind closed doors, unspeakable things were happening, and although on the surface it seemed like an outgoing, luxury lifestyle of cool people just having fun, it was really anything but that once you got to the core of the group. When Angel's Landing went from Texas to Wichita, Kansas, they actually gained 3 new members: Lou's real estate agent and 2 young daughters. This real estate agent sold Lou the property, and upon meeting him, she felt very compelled to not only be close to him, but protect him. And he shortly after confessed to her that he was an angel. Because of this information, this real estate agent uprooted herself and her 2 young daughters from Missouri to Wichita, Kansas to join the commune, leaving her husband and her children's father behind. I'm assuming you can guess where this is going, and it ended up with Lou assaulting and abusing both of these young girls. But not only that, combining it with mental manipulation to make them feel like it was almost normal, which it obviously wasn't at all. In 2003, the story got a lot more publicized, as one of the members living in the commune had passed away. This member had seemingly fallen, hit their head, and then fell into the pool, which caused them to drown and die, which obviously got a lot of attention but wasn't necessarily considered suspicious, at least not legally. The death aligned with most accidental drowning deaths and was not considered for having any foul play, although that didn't mean that there wasn't any questions stirring about this commune within the community. At this time, unbeknownst to Lou and the rest of the commune, the police were actually closely monitoring the commune, but not for the reasons you may have thought. They were being monitored by the narcotics department because Lou had unexplained wealth, and their assumption was that there was an illegal drug operation or something along those lines funding this 10-acre ranch with seemingly unlimited money. And with the news breaking of this death on the property, some members in the community had their own questions as well. This member that they lost was considered to be the mother of the group, and she was Lou's right-hand woman. And it was a tragic loss within the group and outside of the group, as she was somebody that people looked up to and at least had a positive relationship with publicly. Following the death of the member who passed away in the pool, the other members of the group were waiting for Lou to bring her back, as he claimed that this was an ability of his. And after some time passed, Lou changed his story and claimed that he doesn't want to bring Patricia back. Lou claimed that where Patricia is now is much better than where we are, and that our goal is to meet her where she's at and not to bring her back here. And I suppose that was a satisfactory response to some of the members. And although the death was ruled as accidental, the FBI was interested, to say the least. They began looking into a Lou Castro and realized that there is no record of this person existing. No documents, no birth certificate, no driver's license. They were dealing with a ghost, until they found one piece of information referencing the name. This was an obituary for a woman he used to live with in a previous smaller commune. This woman had passed away with her new boyfriend and daughter during a leisure flight, and unfortunately, shortly after takeoff, this entire group passed away. It's an interesting side note, but Lou was previously a plane mechanic. That, again, was ruled as an accidental death. But the coincidences are starting to kind of fall apart here. 3 years after the death of the woman in the pool, her husband, another member of Angel's Landing, was killed as well. He was working on his car and laying underneath a vehicle when his jack failed, crushing and killing him. The unfortunate and tragic death of this second member of Angel's Landing was a pivotal moment in discovering the truth. Like I mentioned, the Angel's Landing group was already under investigation secretly by the FBI and local authorities. But once 2 accidental deaths took place within 3 years, they cranked up their search and began looking at alternative means of information. And one thing they found that cracked this case wide open was the insurance payouts on these group members. Both Patricia, the woman who died in the pool, and her husband, who died under the car years later, had large life insurance policies, both of which specifically paying out to the Angel's Landing group, which was 100% controlled by Lou Castro. Each of these policies paid out over $1.2 million. And suddenly, things are starting to make a lot of sense. Somebody who's able to predict deaths and then have them magically happen, somebody who has accidental deaths magically follow him around, and somebody who has an unexplainable amount of wealth, but no source of income. All now starts to make a lot more sense when you realize that there may be some foul play going on here. But in case that's not enough to make you convinced that there was something really strange going on in this cult, 2 years after the husband of the initial woman who died passed away, there was a third death within the group. It was the death of the real estate agent who moved into the commune to protect him. This same woman that had 2 young daughters in the group. Lou got her 2 young daughters together and told them that it was her mother's time and that she was going to die shortly. Obviously, they were extremely upset and didn't want to believe it, and they told their mom. And their mom didn't seem too fazed and reassured them that she wasn't going anywhere and that she was going to be fine. But unfortunately, 2 days later, she passed away in a horrible car accident. And at that point, detectives were no longer allowing this to go on anymore. Once again, a life insurance payout was due to hit Lou's account any day. And coincidentally, the previous balance was getting pretty low from the last payout. It's almost like this was how he was funding his lifestyle. At this point, detectives were just going to his property and had a unique plan to collect fingerprints to try to get more information. They knocked on Lou's door and they told him that they were looking for information on local criminals and had pictures of criminals that they wanted him to potentially identify. The detectives entered his home and were starting to show him pictures, hoping to get fingerprints on the photographs, but they noticed that Lou was only grabbing these photos with his fingernails, meaning that he knew what was going on and that they were not going to get any fingerprints. Eventually, they were able to get him on charges of bank fraud, but realized that they needed to get him on these murders if they wanted him to serve any substantial time. And at this point, the stars almost aligned, because the eldest of the 2 young girls who were a part of this group at this point was an adult, and had met a man who shortly became her boyfriend. Not long into dating, they had a moment and she opened up to him about everything. And that night when she went to bed, he went to the FBI website and informed them about everything that was going on in this strange cult in Wichita. Surprisingly, they were quick to respond, collected her statement, and began a full-blown investigation on all of these claims. At this point, they were able to speak to the younger daughter as well, where they were able to collect all the information they needed to put this man away for a serious amount of time. During this Lou person's trial, it was revealed that his name isn't Lou at all, and that was only one of his many aliases, and that his name is Daniel Perez, and he has an extensive history of sexual abuse and much more. And the result of this trial happened in 2015, when Daniel Perez, aka Lou Castro, was sentenced with 80 years in prison. Unfortunately, all of the deaths involving Angel's Landing were still ruled accidental, but they did have a strong enough case through all of the other crimes to put him away for the rest of his life. Okay, I know this is a cult video and not a true crime video, but for Angel's Landing specifically, the beliefs were rather simple. And it wasn't even super religious, honestly. This mysterious, wealthy man just claimed that he was an angel and could predict deaths and save people near him if they did die. And he also required intimacy with children to maintain his powers. Although in reality, he was just a pedophile who was killing his own cult members for insurance payouts to fund his lifestyle. So the religious beliefs are simple, but the lore of the actual story is insane. And I thought you guys would appreciate this twisted story. I know we focused on a lot of mind-bending, twisted, pseudo-religious, disgusting beliefs, so I wanted to kind of focus on the reality of the life in these cults in this story. But the more research I did, the more invested I got in this story. And well, here we go. Before we get into the last cult of this video, I just want to say that it is the unfortunate reality that there is so many crazy and scary cults that have existed and still exist to this day. And although I hand-selected a few for this first video, I do have a sizable number of other cults I do want to discuss, although I didn't want to make this video extremely long in case it wasn't something you guys were interested in, because I haven't really discussed cults on the channel before. So if you guys are interested about more scary and truly disturbing cults, let me know in the comments or leave this video a like. This sort of engagement helps me understand what videos you guys actually want to see. But with that, let's get into our final cult, of this video at least. Let's say that you have absolutely no interest in any sort of religious group at all. Let's just say that you're interested in history, and let's say that maybe you found a particular interest with the Knights Templar, the Catholic military group tasked with protecting the Holy Grail. Perhaps that's an area of interest for you. Well, what if you were approached by some individuals who claimed to be the descendants of that military group and claimed to hold their ideals and then some? You may be interested in hearing them out. And what if these people claimed to you that not only were they the descendants of the Knights Templar, but one of the members was also the reincarnation of Moses from the Bible and King Tut's dad? At that point, you're likely gone, but let's say you're still a little interested. But here's the catch. Even if you're potentially interested in hearing them out, you have to be approved. specifically through a sizable donation, as this cult is a pretty elitist group, with a group size at its peak of only around 300 to 400 members. So unless you were really wealthy, you weren't even able to hear them out, because they believed that only the richest were even worthy of hearing their message. This was the message of the Order of the Solar Temple, a Neo-Templar movement and a cult. This group had members in Canada, Switzerland, and France. One of the founders of this cult actually had a child with another cult member and believed that this child was a perfect child and that it was a higher being, and that any children that were to happen within the cult would be higher beings as well too, to help his daughter on her purpose. The cult grew and grew, and over time there was a lot of mismanagement happening between the two founders who didn't speak much about the direction of the cult. One leader was focusing on the inner workings of the cult, specifically the meditations, ceremonies, and day-to-day management, and the other leader was focused on the recruitment process, essentially running seminars and spreading the message of their special little group. Because this cult required very significant financial backing, members started to become uneasy on where their money was going, as the cult seemed to have not been growing as much as it once was. And this perfect higher level baby was now a teenager, and she was starting to rebel against her own father as well. And in 1991, one of the ex-members actually sued the group, which definitely started to show the writing on the wall for this elitist cult. And the next year, in 1992, one of the cult leaders was actually arrested for trying to buy illegal firearms in Canada, which is some unfortunate foreshadowing for what's about to happen. Later that year, people were becoming more and more restless, as not only were they unsure about where their money was going, but at this point there were so many unfulfilled spiritual promises that people were starting to not believe any of the claims of these cult leaders. This is where things get dark. As the cult was beginning to crumble and they were losing members and backing, they felt that they needed to figure out something quick, and they decided that they needed to have a transition within their movement. This was a transition to another world. At this point, they began to prepare themselves and certain high-ranking people within the Solar Temple that they believed would be highly favored in this new world, aka people that they probably thought they could manipulate. While they were prepping their members about how to transition into this new world, they were also planning how they would get revenge for those who they felt betrayed them, aka people who saw through the lies and left. The spree of this cult's revenge, starting with highly ranking cult members showing up at the door of previous cult members and stabbing their 5-month-old baby in the heart, as the leader of the Solar Temple claimed that this baby was the Antichrist, when in reality, the parents of this baby, who were also murdered in this horrific event, were simply people who didn't listen to the Solar Temple's demands, which were that they didn't get married and didn't have this baby because it wasn't what the higher beings wanted. It was essentially a power struggle that these former members were no longer interested in playing into. After this horrific murder, there was other instances of strange murder suicides until one of the most insane events associated with this cult happened. On the 5th of October in 1994, 23 people were found dead in a burning chalet in Switzerland. Their bodies were arranged in a circle, and they were all wearing ceremonial robes. After this mass death event, which was more murder than suicide, as most of the participants in this group didn't realize that they were going to be killed and left in a building that would be set on fire. Regardless, in total, 74 people died over the course of the multiple murders and mass murder suicides that happened because of the Order of the Solar Temple. And it's not even known how many of these deaths were suicides and how many of these deaths were murders. Because the founders of this cult were killed in these rituals and any of the remaining members went into hiding, the authorities were stumped at what to do because there was nobody to charge and not much that they could do, as most of the participants were gone as well. The result was an extremely strengthened anti-cult movement in Europe, specifically in Francophone Europe. As this event was extremely publicized, the word was finally out about the danger that can be caused by cults. I suppose the one true silver lining about cults is the fact that they always seem to be self-imploding, although even a few moments of existence for the cults that I mentioned today are longer than they should have ever existed. Crazy missing persons cases that are still unsolved. Kenneth Lee Veach was born in Clark County, Las Vegas in 1967. He was always drawn to the nature that surrounded him, and throughout his adolescence into his adulthood loved anything that involved being outside and experiencing nature. Kenneth, or Kenny, was actually so passionate about his outdoor excursions that he had an entire YouTube channel dedicated to documenting his adventures, as well as his inventions, with the channel being named Snakebit McGee. The channel still exists to this day and has 73,000 subscribers, and it currently has 5 videos posted on it, with the most ominous being named M Cave Hike. The reason why this video is significant is what we'll be getting into, and is directly correlated with the mysterious disappearance of Kenny Veach. The year is 2014, and Kenny Veach is on YouTube looking at interesting videos, similar to what you're doing right now. And Kenny happened to stumble on a video that was rather obscure. It was a video of a son of an Area 51 technician, and in this video he was talking about things that his father had told him while drunk. After watching this video, Kenny left a comment describing a very odd situation he experienced near Area 51 himself. In the comment, he mentioned that when he was hiking in the Sheep Range, which is very close to Area 51, he discovered a cave that was shaped like the letter M. As he approached this cave, the cave made his body vibrate, and the closer that he got to this cave, the more that his body began to vibrate and feel unease. He described the feeling as uncomfortable and made him feel scared, so scared in fact that he didn't approach the cave any further, and actually did the exact opposite, fleeing from the cave immediately and going directly back to his car, cutting his hike short. This comment was simply intended to share a peculiar story that happened also with Area 51, but his comment quickly gained attention. People began to reply to Kenny's comment, either questioning the authenticity behind it, sharing sympathy, or even motivating him to go and revisit this location to find the truth and dig deeper on what exactly was going on. After getting enough responses of people either telling him his story was fake or telling him that he needs to prove his claim or seek more truth by revisiting the cave, he planned a second trip. And in October of 2014, Kenny Veach returned to the Sheep Range outside of Area 51 in an attempt to locate the M-shaped cave. This second trip was documented, and that documentation is the video titled M Cave Hike. Already, there's some interesting things about this situation. Specifically, that in this 20-minute video, Veach reported that he saw a black Ram truck watching him from the ridgeline in the mountain range behind him this entire hike that he was having. And he was also not able to find this cave the second time around. But obviously, the mystery doesn't end here, and it's only truly beginning. After the first hike ending in fear and abandonment, and the second hike ending in failure, Kenny planned a third trip, where he publicly announced that he would be looking for the M Cave and be finding it once and for all. On November 10th, 2014, only a few weeks after the second attempt, Kenny Veach went on a third expedition looking for the M Cave. This third hike was like any other hike Kenny could have gone on. He packed a cell phone, a gun, and other supplies into his truck, and even informed his girlfriend before he left what he was up to and where he was going to be. He did not give specific details about his location, but he did tell her that he was going on a trip, he was looking for the M Cave, and he would be back at some point, which was typical behavior for Kenny. He was an experienced outdoorsman, and it wasn't uncommon for him to spend multiple days outside alone. Although when Kenny left for this third expedition looking for the M Cave, he was never seen again. After several days of not hearing anything from Kenny, his girlfriend reported him missing, and a large-scale search was underway. The search party looking for Kenny consisted of volunteers and officials from the Nevada Search and Rescue Team, and these men and women worked tirelessly day and night, searching high and low through mountains and caves of the Mojave Desert. One of the biggest challenges these search and rescue teams faced was the fact that the general location that Kenny said he was going was not an easy hike at all. It was mountainous. The landscape was dotted with old mine shafts. The area itself was isolated, and according to Kenny in old forum posts, it took roughly 10 hours of hiking to go from his car to the M Cave, meaning that this search and rescue crew had a lot of ground to cover. On top of just geographical issues, this area was also known for being dangerous. Specifically because it was so remote and so isolated, there was reports of drug activity and even bodies being dumped in the general area. Not to mention being literally beside a military base, there was also claims of reported chemical disposal in the area as well. However, even with this uphill battle that the volunteers and search and rescue team were facing, they still continued their search. And on November 22nd, 12 days after Kenny had initially left for this third trip to the M Cave, the search team found something. Near an abandoned mine shaft, one of the search and rescue members found a cell phone that was confirmed to have been owned by Kenny Veach. But unfortunately, this was the only piece of evidence that was ever found. There was no piece of clothing, no other personal items, and no clues anywhere. The only information that the phone really gave was that Kenny likely got to where he was looking to go, as this phone was in the general location that Kenny described the M Cave being in. But that's where the facts end and the speculation begins. Because after the disappearance of Kenny Veach gained attention, people began to have a plethora of theories. Likely the most possible and accepted conclusion to the story actually comes from Kenny's girlfriend herself. As years after this entire situation happened, she was informed that Kenny's story was going viral online, and she felt compelled to leave a comment on Kenny's M Cave hike video. The comment is long, and if you want to read it in its entirety, on screen is a screenshot, and I will quickly mention the main points Kenny's girlfriend Sharon makes. One of the biggest revelations that Sharon shares in this comment was that Kenny had been struggling with depression for many years. She, being his girlfriend, was obviously aware of this, and he had opened up to her, and he had made it clear to her that in the time leading up to his disappearance, it was progressively getting worse. And Kenny had even expressed his thoughts of suicide to Sharon directly. That alone is extremely upsetting, both for Kenny and for his girlfriend, who had to carry that burden with him. And if you or a loved one have experienced depression, then you know how upsetting even that part of the story is. One chilling quote Kenny mentioned to Sharon was that if he ever decided to end things, quote, "no one will ever find me." On top of sharing this quote, she also stated a very interesting fact, that Kenny had not taken his video camera for this third attempt to find the M cave, which was odd because his second attempt was filmed, and he even hyped up his third attempt in video. So why would he not bring his camera on a trip that he publicly said he would be filming? Sharon claims that he didn't take his camera because he obviously didn't intend to record anything. On top of sharing facts, Sharon also shared a few of her own suspicions. She believes that Kenny specifically left his phone in a mineshaft to avoid being tracked. And she even states explicitly that, quote, "I believe he committed suicide. He battled depression for many years and would not take medication or see a doctor. He quit his job a little more than a year before he disappeared." Truthfully, I don't know if anybody could possibly make a stronger claim than Sharon. She was in a committed, long-term relationship with Kenny, knew the ins and outs of his personality and life, and was the last person who ever saw Kenny. However, with Kenny never being found, it's impossible to confirm these claims. And when facts aren't concrete, people are always going to make their own assumptions, leading to the other two theories surrounding Kenny's disappearance. The second theory is that Kenny simply experienced an accidental death, which is possible considering the conditions that Kenny was hiking in. The Nevada desert is harsh, with extremely hot and extremely cold temperatures. And specifically in the area of the M cave, there was a plethora of old mine shafts to potentially fall into. However, the elephant in the room obviously is the fact that Kenny was experienced in this area. And on top of being experienced in this specific area, he was also an experienced outdoorsman, making this theory a bit tough to believe, but still plausible. However, the third theory is really just a conspiracy theory, and is essentially just the belief that Kenny was getting too close to finding something out. And for that reason, Kenny was killed by the US military, specifically so he didn't discover the secret of the M cave. It's definitely out there, but with no facts and no sign of Kenny ever being found, it's not impossible. Potentially one of the most interesting facts about this entire situation is that even though so many aspects of the story are still available online, Kenny's YouTube channel, Kenny's video about the M cave, Kenny's girlfriend's comment on the M cave video, the one thing that was removed from the internet was Kenny's comment on the original video that sparked this entire situation. Whether Kenny deleted it or someone else deleted it, the comment was there and somewhere along the line was removed. Nobody truly knows what happened to Kenny Veach and where he may be today, dead or alive. It's Saturday, October the 21st, 1978. Relatively new pilot Frederick Valentich was embarking on a short training flight in a Cessna 128L light aircraft. The flight itself wasn't extremely long, only 232 kilometers or 125 nautical miles. And this flight was connecting Melbourne, Australia to King Island following the Bass Strait. At this point, Frederick had 150 total flight hours and even held a Class 4 instrument rating, which authorized him to fly at night with the restriction of only being able to fly at night in visible meteorological conditions, essentially meaning clear enough skies to be able to see the ground, terrain, and other aircraft. Frederick had also applied twice to enlist in the Royal Australian Air Force, but was rejected each time due to inadequate educational qualifications. Although as determined as Frederick was to become a pilot, his grades weren't necessarily reflecting his passion. On top of actively taking training flights and also being in the Air Training Corps for the Australian Air Force, Frederick was also studying to become a commercial pilot as well. Although, even with all of his training, he failed all 5 of his commercial license exams twice. Even with failed exams and rejected applications, Frederick was motivated to fly, and this brings us back to October 21st, 1978. Frederick's takeoff was normal, and the beginning of his flight appeared to be relatively calm and uneventful, although things began to get peculiar when he radioed to the Melbourne Flight Service at 7:06 p.m. p.m. It was in this radio message that he reported an unidentified aircraft that was following him at 4,500 feet. Air traffic control confirmed that there was no traffic at that level, although Frederick was certain that he was seeing something. Frederick replied stating that he could see a large unknown aircraft, which appeared to be illuminated but couldn't confirm the exact type of plane he was looking at. And then quickly after confirmed that this plane had passed over him, roughly 1,000 feet above him, moving at a very fast speed. Once again, air traffic control had no answers. Almost immediately after, Frederick radioed in again, saying that this aircraft was orbiting above him and that it had a shiny metal surface with a green light on it, and then also stated that this other pilot might be purposely toying with him in his aircraft. And it was with his next radio message that Frederick revealed something concerning. He was experiencing engine problems. But before Frederick could even finish his sentence, air traffic control was asking him, what kind of plane is this? To which Frederick could only say, it's not an aircraft. And it was right after he said these words. His transmissions were interrupted by the sounds of metallic scraping, all contact was lost, and Frederick was never heard from again. It wasn't long after the connection was cut that a search and rescue mission was underway, and a sea and air search took place to find him as soon as possible. The search went on for 4 days, and was concluded on October 25th, 1978 with no results. No sign of Frederick, no signs of his plane. The investigation was simply presumed fatal. The story is obviously upsetting and doesn't end there. And I didn't even mention this earlier, but when this all took place, Frederick was only 20 years old. He was a young, semi-experienced, and also struggling pilot. Frederick also had gotten into legal trouble from some of his flights, specifically for accidentally flying into controlled air zones in Sydney, and even intentionally flying into clouds, which was prohibited for his classifications. Both of these are odd, because if you are dedicating your life to a career in aviation, why would you intentionally fly into clouds on multiple occasions if you knew it could lead to prosecution, which in his case, it almost did? Those facts are interesting, but what's also interesting is a quote from Frederick's father, who stated that Frederick was not only a large believer in UFOs, but was also seriously worried about being attacked by them on his flights. It's even stated that 6 days before his disappearance, Frederick talked to his girlfriend specifically about the possibility that a UFO could take him away. And potentially what's most odd about this entire flight that Frederick took was the fact that he never told anybody the truth of why he was taking this flight. Sure, it was a relatively standard training flight, but why on a Saturday evening? His flight took off at 6 p.m. and it was a multi-hour flight. It's reported that Frederick told flight officials that he was just going to King Island to pick up some friends and fly them back. But it's also reported that he told other officials that he was going to pick up crayfish. And after the disappearance happened, investigations confirmed that both of these stated reasons were untrue. But that's where the facts end. And once again, where the speculation begins to run wild. All we know is that we have a 20-year-old struggling pilot in training who has an interesting obsession and fear of UFOs, who took a mysterious flight from Melbourne to King Island, and during this flight claimed to have seen a UFO and was never seen again. But it's curious to think of what could have possibly happened. And obviously, since 46 years have passed since this entire situation happened, some theories have popped up. One of the official suspicions comes from the Western Australia Department of Transportation, who stated that Frederick became disoriented, saw his own lights reflected in the water, or saw a nearby island while flying upside down, which is potentially plausible, but there was no communication indicating that Frederick was in such a situation that would have left him upside down. Some people believe that Frederick actually staged his own disappearance, and instead of going to King Island, was actually going to Cape Otway, which was possible to fly to with the plane that Frederick was in and with the amount of fuel that he had. And although there's no radar to confirm this activity in the Cape Otway area, Melbourne police did receive reports of a mysterious landing that took place by a light aircraft at the same time that Frederick disappeared. A third and potentially most disheartening theory is that Frederick did this intentionally. Although interviews with doctors and personal friends of Frederick all stated that this was likely impossible, which, I mean, nothing's impossible, but if nobody thinks that this is the case, I think there's validity that this might not be the answer. And one of the last major groups of belief involves aliens. Basically, UFOologists claim that UFOs either destroyed Frederick's ship with Frederick inside or abducted him and then destroyed his ship. And you could potentially put some validity on these claims due to what Frederick was actually saying in his radio comms. Those are kind of three of the initial theories, but there are actually more modern theories that are definitely worth mentioning. The first comes from Brian Dunning, who made the observation that the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind came out a few years before this entire situation, and the things that Frederick was saying on the radio kind of sounded similar from some of the dialogue from the movie, not to mention the fact that this movie was also popular with pilots. So with that information, Dunning ultimately speculated that Frederick likely was trying trying to reenact the scene in real life for his own, personal enjoyment. He was deliberately flying his aircraft in a sporadic manner to kind of put on a show for air traffic controllers, but within him having this fun and saying these lies and flying in an unsafe way, he essentially became disoriented and crashed unintentionally. I'm not sure how valid it is, but I think it's interesting to consider, specifically knowing that he did intentionally fly into clouds when he wasn't supposed to, so it's not like he wasn't against breaking the rules. So if you really loved this movie and really loved aliens, maybe he thought it'd be cool to take a little flight, tell the story on the way, and then once he came back, he'd be like, wow, that was crazy, I had a UFO encounter, and just basically allow that legend to live on as part of his personal lore. But like I mentioned, these are all speculations, and the mystery of the missing pilot, Frederick Valentich, remains to this day unsolved, 46 years and 6 months later. Unfortunately, there's a lot more unsolved missing persons cases. And if you guys truly enjoyed this video and would like me to create a series out of it, just leave a comment below or leave a like. Your support never goes unnoticed and is always appreciated. But with that being said, let's continue to the final story. The year is 1993, and we are days away from the much-anticipated Super Bowl weekend. David Glenn Lewis, like almost any man at the time, was excited about Super Bowl weekend. And coincidentally, David was about to have Super Bowl weekend all to himself. David was a lawyer and a family man, and he lived with his wife and daughter in Amarillo, Texas. David's wife and daughter were actually going to Houston for the weekend to have a bit of a getaway, and specifically do some shopping. Now, this is a trip that David would typically be a part of, but because this was Super Bowl weekend, he decided that he'd stay back because he didn't want to miss the big game, and likely just wanted some alone time as well. On Friday, January 29th, 1993, David's wife and daughter left for their planned shopping trip in Dallas. But on January 31st, after what I can only imagine to be a fun shopping trip, David's wife and daughter returned home slightly later in the evening, basically right after the Super Bowl ended. But what they came home to was a bit peculiar. The TV was on, the VCR was actually still recording the game, there was 2 freshly made turkey sandwiches in the fridge, there was laundry in the laundry machine, David's wedding ring and watch were on the kitchen counter, but David was nowhere to be seen. David's wife, Karen, obviously assumed David was somewhere nearby, potentially watching the game at a friend's house, although when they didn't find him at all that night, they began to get concerned. The following morning, on February 1st, David's wife, Karen, called the police and reported him missing. But like every other story in this video, this isn't where the story ends. It's where the story begins. And in this story specifically, the twist at the end of it is potentially the most mind-boggling in this entire video. Back to February 1st. What happened? Karen was convinced that her husband wasn't just at a friend's house for the night watching the game, and although she may have been slightly irritated or concerned the night before, this morning she was only concerned, and that concern was growing. Once police were involved, it wasn't long before information began rolling in. Although with all of the information coming to light about the situation, there was only more questions being uncovered and almost no answers. The first pieces of information that became available came from the police. The same day that the report was made, police actually found Lewis's car parked downtown by a courthouse. When the police searched his car, they found all of his keys under the floor mat. Also hidden within the car were David's checkbook, driver's license, and 2 of his credit cards. After police found David's vehicle, they checked his bank activity, and it was at that point when the plot only grew thicker, because his bank activity was strange to say the least. On January 30th, the day after his wife and daughter left town, $5,000 was deposited into his account, but it's unknown who did this and why they did this. And then the next day, the 31st, the day of the Super Bowl, either David or someone using David's card purchased a plane ticket from Amarillo to Dallas, and then another plane ticket was purchased from Los Angeles to Dallas. Both of these plane tickets were in David's name, but it's unconfirmed if either of these plane tickets were used. When the police first brought all of these discoveries to Karen, she was obviously concerned, but little did the police know that Karen had her own bombshell for the police. Karen mentioned to the police that David specifically expressed to Karen that he felt like his life was in danger. Lewis had specifically been a defendant in a lawsuit brought against him and several other lawyers, although after several months of this lawsuit going on, David was the only defendant who has not yet disposed the case. Some people believe that the law firm that David worked for that was being sued by a previous client were pressuring David into giving a disposition that wasn't fully accurate, trying to make him lie about some of the wrongdoings of the law firm that he worked for the benefit of the law firm. Because all of the other lawyers at this law firm had given a disposition and David hadn't, it definitely could have put a target on his back if he was not willing to comply with their less than integral requests of him. For 11 months following the disappearance, even with all of the weird information that they found initially and continued to find, there was absolutely no sign of David anywhere. Not a motive, not a body, not evidence, nothing, literally nothing. And after those 11 months, the official conclusion that the authorities came to on this case was that David must have just left on his own accord and decided to start a new life somewhere else without telling anybody. And undoubtedly, that was a hard pill to swallow for the family. But unfortunately, that was the reality they had to accept. And that alone is crazy and peculiar. If the story ended right there, this would definitely be a story worthy of this video. Somebody disappearing without a trace who seemed to have been home hours ago is just mind-boggling. But the story doesn't end here at all, because 10 years after the case was closed, a bombshell was dropped on the entire situation. In 2004, just over 10 years after David initially went missing, a bored police officer in Washington state was researching cold cases while on duty. Something this police officer likely did often. And on this specific day, this police officer had stumbled on the case of David Glenn Lewis. At first, the story was like many others that he read, but what caught his attention was the photo associated with this missing person. This police officer took one look at David and realized that this was somebody that he had not only seen before, but this was a man that he had found dead 10 years ago. This person that he had found dead in 1993 was actually a hit and run case. And because he was so sure that he had seen this man before, he did a bit more digging and tried to line up the dates. And he was able to confirm that the man that he had found dead, he had found only a day after David Lewis was reported missing, meaning that the timelines added up and he had some further digging to do. This is where things get even more strange, because the person this police officer found in Washington state in this hit and run case, although he looked like David Lewis, he didn't have any identification of being David Lewis. He was an unknown person wearing military fatigues walking down the side of the highway with no ID and no personal belongings at all. And unfortunately, he was struck by a vehicle and left for dead, which is where the police officer eventually found him. But even though this police officer was certain that these people looked the exact same, and the dates kind of lined up, how could he be sure that these two people were the same person? After all, this hit and run case took place 1,600 miles from where David Lewis supposedly disappeared from. And although there was plane tickets on David Lewis's credit cards, none of them involved Washington state. So the only way this police officer could know for certain was by getting a DNA test done, which after some time and some convincing, he was able to have the DNA test performed. And the results from that test confirmed that this unnamed man that was found dead on the side of the road on February 1st, 1993 in Washington state was indeed David Glenn Lewis, who was only a night earlier watching the Super Bowl in the comfort of his own home. Nobody knows why David was in Washington state, a place where he had no friends, no family, no connections. Nobody even knows how he got to Washington state. His own personal vehicle was at the courthouse. He was wearing military fatigues that weren't his. And nobody even knows why he even left his couch, let alone the state. So like I mentioned, even though a decade after this disappearance happened, his body was found and confirmed, nothing about this mystery is solved whatsoever, and no substantial evidence up until today has been discovered. Even with this discovery, even though David specifically claimed that he believed his life was in danger, it is officially believed that David simply got up and decided to leave on his own accord, and there was no foul play whatsoever. And for the families, I truly feel for them, because I can't imagine how disheartening it is to have that official conclusion be the case when obviously something was going on here. But unfortunately, this story and the other two we spoke about all have the same ending. No truth is officially known. The causes, the motivations, the truth about what actually happened is still a mystery, and might remain a mystery forever. And with that, I would like to once again invite you to leave a comment below if you have any thoughts about these cases. Do you have any additional information about these cases? Is there anything I missed? Do you have a theory? Let me know in the comments below. I love reading your comments and I'd love to spark conversation. Creepy modern mysteries that are still unsolved. Most people don't realize how common mysteries are. Honestly, if you pay attention, you'll find mysteries all around us. Just the other day, I was sitting at a cafe when I lost one of my most prized possessions. I left my hat on my seat as I went to the bathroom for maybe 2 minutes. But when I got back, my hat was gone. But the weirdest part was that the cafe was full of people and not a single person saw who took my hat. Luckily, I have a lot of hats, and in the grand scheme of things, that wasn't really a hard mystery to figure out. But not all mysteries are as easy to crack. In fact, today I've compiled a list of mysterious crimes, events, entities, and other unsolved mysteries so perplexing that to this day they remain unsolved. And as always, this list gets scarier as it goes on. Number 1, the missing wrecking ball. In 1974, workers for the Dowling Construction Company in Indianapolis left their crane to go home, just like any other day. As usual, the 5-ton steel wrecking ball remained hanging from this crane about 200 feet in the air. The next morning, the entire wrecking ball was flat out gone. And no, it hadn't fallen to the ground, it was gone from the entire site. The whole town, along with police, were baffled by this bizarre theft and that the wrecking ball was never found. Apparently, some people criticized them for leaving the wrecking ball like that, but I mean, what else are you supposed to do? Detach the wrecking ball and roll it into a giant adamantium safe for good keeping? Also, what's the motive for stealing a 5-ton wrecking ball? According to my research, 5 tons of steel is only worth about $800. Imagine going through all of the effort of stealing a 5-ton wrecking ball and still not having enough money to afford 9 grams of gold. Part of me wonders if the reason this case went cold is because nobody really cared. I mean, if I had to spend more time tracking down a defective wrecking ball on the loose than completing the construction project with my crew, I'd probably just forget it too. I'd like to think that everyone just assumed that somehow the cable cut itself loose and the ball comically rolled 2 miles down the road at night off a cliff into the ocean. The worst part about this case is the more I researched it, the more mysterious it became. If you look up this company, you'll find that they're pretty much only known for losing this wrecking ball. And in one newspaper from the same time period, I was able to find a story with an interview from the owner of the company who lost the ball. The funniest part about the story is that Lauren Dowling, the owner of the Dowling Construction Company, said, and I quote, "I can't figure out what someone would want to do with a 5-ton metal ball." Then another newspaper I found provided a couple more details in the story. In this paper, an interviewer named Beck Walter asked someone who knew about the story personally, "Is this story true? If so, when and where did it happen? Was the ball ever found?" Then, Sincero, the man she was interviewing, said, "It's true, according to Lauren Dowling, owner of the firm. His workers were tearing down and erecting a boys' club on the Indianapolis South Side during the summer of 1974. Just like your book says, the huge ball was hanging about 200 feet in the air from a crane at the end of the workday and was gone 8 hours later when the workers returned. The crane didn't appear to be tampered with," said Dowling, "but the ball was never recovered." What's also strange about this case is that no leads for any potential suspects were ever found, which is confusing considering you would probably need to run some seriously loud equipment in order to manage carrying a steel ball the weight of multiple cars away in the middle of the night. On top of this, the thieves left no tire tracks. Also, it didn't look like the thieves had tampered with the crane, and the wrecking ball didn't seem to have fallen because there was no crater on the ground where it would have landed. If you're open to some pretty crazy conclusions, I found some people on a mystery forum theorizing that some type of interdimensional time traveler from the future somehow teleported the wrecking ball into a different universe to save someone from a Final Fantasy style incident that was destined to kill them. So, yeah. All in all, no matter how you choose to interpret the story, although this is a tame example, the story is still rather strange. Number 2, kidnapped by Sasquatch. Nowadays, when we hear about Bigfoot, we typically laugh, but that's only because we were born in the modern day. Today, Bigfoot has become a meme, but this is only because most people in the modern era live in a town, city, or some sort of civilization that is not so rural. But for those in the past or even today who still live deep in the woods, woodland creatures are nothing to laugh at. It's easy to laugh at a mysterious creature when you're deep in the city, surrounded by humans living in a concrete building, but it's not so easy to laugh at a creature of the woods when you live in a wooden house in the middle of nowhere and you realize the creature you fear so deeply could tear the roof off of your house. These stories are stories of people alone, surrounded by woods, with truly no idea what lies beyond their small house's boundaries. When you're deep in the woods, you truly have no idea what's out there. Technology won't be there to save you. And in the times that these historic accounts took place, there was no GPS, no walkie-talkie, and no phone. The only satellites flying around Earth at this point were lonely, barren asteroids. And if you got lost in the woods, the question wasn't what your odds of dying were, it was what your odds of living were. In this time, a man had to come face to face with his own natural habitat and anything that dwells within it. When I tell you of these accounts, you have to keep in mind that these aren't just urban folklore. They are actual published accounts that resulted from real-life adventures before the internet and before safety. Also, there weren't cities and towns populating almost every area of the Earth like there are today. So if you were alone in the wilderness, at times the empty asteroid orbiting you in space was closer to you than the nearest human. What most modern day people forget is that the concept of Bigfoot or Sasquatch came from multiple real-life accounts from real people who often came across Bigfoot face to face. Before I begin this story, I want to preface it with an interesting fact. According to historical accounts, Albert Ostman, the man who had this strange encounter, refused to tell anyone his story for many years because, in his words, he didn't think that anybody would believe him. To be honest, if I had something as crazy as the story I'm about to tell you happen to me, I wouldn't think anyone would believe me either. Nevertheless, many of the details in his description ended up being consistent with other similar accounts of creatures in the same area that came out later. Keep in mind that this was long before the internet, and it's pretty unlikely that Albert was able to communicate with the others who came out with similar descriptions later on. In 1924, Albert Ostman, who was a logger and construction worker, had a vacation. When people in our era, the modern day, think of going on vacation, we imagine going on a cruise or maybe going to the beach, or maybe even staying at a nice lake house. But Albert was an absolute mad lad, and his idea of a vacation was searching for a lost gold mine rumored to be at the head of the Toba Inlet in British Columbia. In all honesty, I wish I was this cool. Sasquatch or not, deciding that for your vacation you're gonna trek through the wilderness alone, looking for a lost gold mine like you're Indiana Jones, has to be one of the more badass things I've heard in a long time. Also, sometimes I forget before video games, people just used to do badass things because they just felt like it. There was no social media, no online approval for doing something cool, nothing. People like this guy just did real life side quests because they felt like it. Anyways, apparently when he was on his way to the supposed area, an old Indian boatman warned him about, quote, huge, hairy, big people living in the mountains near the abandoned mine he was looking for. But he just shrugged it off, saying that he, quote, refused to believe old Indian fables about mountain giants. Once he finally got to the inlet where the gold mine was supposedly close to, he left the Indian boatman and started hiking. According to his account, all he brought with him was his rifle, pack sack of food, cooking utensils, sleeping bag, and a ground sheet. After hiking for about a week, he settled down at a camping spot between two big trees that happened to be next to a freshwater spring. For Albert, this campsite was perfect, except for the fact that every morning it appeared that someone or something had rummaged through his supplies and taken all of his food. Albert, being the mad lad we knew he was, instead of being scared and going home or just being plain upset, he made a plan. He climbed into his sleeping bag fully clothed with his rifle right next to him so he could attack whoever or whatever was stealing his food. Like many of us at the sleepover, Albert was the first to fall asleep, and what he woke up to was insane. I was awakened, he wrote, by something picking me up. I was half asleep, and at first I did not remember where I was. As I began to get my wits together, I remembered that I was on a prospecting trip and in my sleeping bag. My first thought was it must be a snowslide, but there was no snow around my camp. Then it felt like I was tossed on horseback, but I could feel whatever it was walking. According to Albert, the creature was carrying him in his sleeping bag, kind of like a DoorDash delivery guy, but not just for a few minutes. For hours. Albert apparently tried cutting his way through the bag that he was being carried in, but he was in such an awkward position in the bag that he couldn't get his knife out of his pocket. After a couple hours, the creature dropped him down, and he heard multiple creatures talking to each other in a weird language that he couldn't understand. At dawn, he finally mustered up the courage to struggle out of his bag and found 4 people who were, quote, covered in hair and wearing no clothes at all. Finally, he realized that the Indian guy on the boat who tried to warn him was right. These were the Sasquatches. As the sun came up, he saw that he was in a valley with mountains all around, and it became apparent to him that the 4 people were some type of Sasquatch family. According to Albert, there was, quote, an old man, old lady, and 2 young ones, a boy and a girl. These creatures didn't do anything to hurt him, but it seemed clear through their behavior that they were, as Albert put it, intent on keeping him. Interestingly, the guy in this story states that he thought that they were human, although they had almost inhuman proportions. This is a summarized quote of what Albert saw. The young fellow might have been between 11 and 18 years old, about 7 feet tall, and might weigh about 300 pounds. He had a wide jaw and a narrow forehead that slanted upward. The hair on their heads was about 6 inches long. The hair on the rest of their body was short and thick in places. The woman was over 7 feet tall. She could have weighed about 500 to 600 pounds. She had very wide hips and a goose-like walk. She was not built for beauty or speed. The man's canines were longer than the rest of his teeth, but not long enough to be called tusks. The old man must have been near 8 feet tall, big barrel chest, and a big hump on his back and shoulders. His forearms were longer than common people, but well proportioned. His fingers were short in proportion to the rest of his hands, but his fingernails were like chisels. After living with the Sasquatch family for 6 days, Albert hilariously got tired of being around them, which makes sense, considering he had basically become the family pet for this Sasquatch family. Once he decided he was going to escape, he waited until none of them were paying attention to him. He reached for his gun, fired his rifle in the air, and in doing this, he was able to startle the family enough to make a run for it and navigate back to the inlet. Albert, of course, made it out and lived to tell the tale. And after the story, I'm probably gonna think twice about going camping alone, or even at all. With this being one of the earlier and most documented and validated Sasquatch stories, the level of detail and sheer circumstance is rather questionable and definitely scary. Were the Sasquatch real? Was he kidnapped? Did he have some sort of psychedelic experience? Was it aliens? Was it all a lie? We'll likely never know. Number 3. A slip in time. In 1901, two English school teachers named Anne Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain were on a holiday trip in France. On this trip, they visited the historic site known as the Palace of Versailles. According to the two of them, they both claimed to have the exact same experience. At some point in their walk, they found themselves over 100 years back in time. They found the Petit Trianon, a small manor house given to Marie Antoinette by Louis XVI, and reportedly saw it exactly how it looked when it was new in 1792. Apparently, they had been taken back to this very specific day for a reason, because according to the school teachers, the day they were taken back to was August 10th, 1792, which was the same historic day that the royal family was forced to flee the palace. The two teachers claimed to have walked on historic pathways that no longer existed and saw people in old-fashioned clothing accurate to the year they were in all around them. The craziest part is that they claimed to have seen Marie Antoinette herself, who was painting in the garden. Apparently, Marie Antoinette looked up at them from the painting and just stared at them, never saying a word. The two teachers didn't really think much about this the day that it happened. Only upon coming back to the site years later after seeing paintings of Marie Antoinette and studying the layout of the palace, they had realized that the palace they were exploring in 1901 was not from 1901. Skeptics of this story claimed that they must have just walked into a costume party that day, but no historical record was ever found of there being a costume party on that specific day. Despite skepticism, the two ladies stood their ground until their death. Part of me just thinks somewhere at this museum site there was some sort of 19th century hippie working there, and when he saw two school teachers getting ready for their afternoon tea, he slipped in a little Salvinorin B methyloxymethyl ether. Jokes aside, this is either the craziest thing I've ever heard or the dumbest thing I've ever heard, and there is no in between. The two interpretations of this story are: 1, two half-drunken school teachers stumbled into a Marie Antoinette costume party or some sort of play and thought that the actor playing Marie Antoinette was actually Marie Antoinette. Or secondly, two school teachers were walking around a historical site and accidentally walked right into the entrance of a wormhole at the exact time some type of interdimensional being opened it up to transfer time periods, sending them back past the back rooms and right into the year 1792. Then the interdimensional time traveling entity was sweating bullets because normal humans were not supposed to be able to get this back in time. So the creature had to go back to the same day, find the two teachers, and bring them back into the present day before they talked to the queen and ruined the entire space-time continuum. But because the women had already changed the present day due to the butterfly effect, the interdimensional entity either had to find another timeline in which the present was congruent with everything they did in 1792 and send them to the universal timeline that we exist today, where I'm telling you the story right now. And putting it that way, I'm starting to think it's just a costume party. But I do find it extremely eerie that one day you can be walking through a building and appreciating its beauty and seeing somebody you thought you recognized, only to later be looking in a history book and realize that you were in a building that was almost 200 years older than you thought, and the person you thought you recognized was Marie Antoinette. Number 4. Unidentified creatures at the mine. Before I start the story, I just want to mention that there seems to be some sort of weird correlation between mine shafts and mysterious forest creatures. This is just a theory, but I'm starting to think that special interest groups who want a certain mining territory for themselves would just put on a costume of some sort to scare away the other prospectors from thinking about working there. Either way, this next story is wild to say the least. In 1924, American miners in Ape Canyon were staying on the east side of Mount St. Helens in the state of Washington. One morning, deep in the woods, Fred Beck and his group of prospectors saw something that baffled them. Around the cabin they had just slept in, they noticed huge human-like footprints that appeared to have been walking around their cabin that night. The worst part about this is this wasn't the first time. The other times this had happened, the prospectors shrugged it off, as if maybe another crew member was playing a prank on them. I mean, other explanations just didn't make sense. Their cabin wasn't in a town, and as far as Mr. Beck knew, there wasn't anybody else around. Weird. But the men carried on with their day, trying not to think about it too much. After a couple of weeks went by with no strange occurrences to be seen, Beck and most of his crew were feeling less tense. I guess it hadn't been a big deal after all, but Beck couldn't shrug this feeling, the feeling that him and his crew were being watched. Then, one day, they were caught off guard. Sitting on a log and eating lunch, one of the men joked about his friend slipping and nearly falling on a squirrel. Beck, lost in laughter, looked to the side to catch his breath, and in an instant, he froze. Cold adrenaline coursed through his head, and his stomach felt like a dagger had been plunged into it. For a split second, Beck thought it was a man, but what he processed next made him mildly dissociate for a second, and he even questioned if he was in a dream. Creepily peeking behind a tree was a huge man-like creature, but it definitely wasn't human. At least 8 feet tall and looking only partially human, it stood there, intently, silently watching them. Immediately, one single question pulsed across Beck's mind. How long has it been watching us? In only a moment, the crew had caught on to what he was looking at, and immediately froze along with him, before quickly shooting multiple shots. One of them hit the creature somewhere in the head and it ran away, seeming to be injured. Another day, Fred Beck walked up on a similar creature standing by the edge of a canyon. Getting more and more frustrated at his own growing fear, he shot the creature in the back, and it keeled over and fell off the cliff. But when the men looked down towards the bottom of the cliff to get a better look at it, they couldn't see it anywhere. That night, however, Fred would soon regret his actions, because little did Fred know that whatever those things were, they would soon seek retribution. You see, by now, most of his crew had abandoned the assignment. They came here to be surveyors and miners. Nobody was getting paid any hazard pay to risk their lives being around these mysterious half-human creatures that wouldn't stop following them. With only a few men that night at his cabin, Fred was awakened, and he wrote, quote, "At least 2 creatures attacked our cabin that night, battering the roof and walls in an attempt to break in. The creatures were able to break a hole in between 2 logs of the cabin. All the while, large thundering strikes could be heard from their rooftop in an attempt to break a hole through it. Luckily, our cabin and its roof were built strong enough to resist snowfall. Even after we made repeated shots out of the cabin hole, the creatures violently persisted, at times wedging their huge hands in between the holes in an attempt to yank our cabin walls apart. 5 hours of relentless beating on the cabin later, the creatures gave up and left the site. Outside, the prospectors found the ground torn up with huge footprints all around. After this, Fred and his crew left for good, abandoning their mine, their cabin, and the mining area entirely. Fred had a pretty high tolerance for many things throughout his life in the mining business, but this was not one of them. All in all, the series of events has never been explained, nor did Fred or his crew ever get a photo of the mysterious creature. The most plausible explanation is this was probably a remote tribe of some type, but that wouldn't explain all of their inhuman characteristics. Either way, if I was Fred, I would have been packing my bags 2 minutes after the first encounter, so props to him for carrying on with his job even after most of his crew left. I'm not sure if he's extremely brave or extremely dumb, but regardless, he's got bigger balls than me and a crazy mystery that's still unsolved. Number 5, killed by a chicken. This story really demonstrates the power belief can have on your body. Deep within the Congo in 1682, an Italian missionary named Father Jerome heard an interesting story about a man who died from his own superstition. During the missionary journey, a young local from the Congo, who we'll just call Zuri, had a sleepover with his friend. Then, in the morning, his friend caught a wild hen and made it for breakfast. Now, for some context, according to the superstitions of the local tribes in the area, young people were absolutely forbidden to eat a wild hen. Now, back to Zuri. When he saw the chicken for breakfast, he asked his friend if it was a wild hen or a farmer's hen. Zuri's friend really didn't feel like going out to find another hen to make, so he lied to Zuri, telling him it was a farmer's hen, when in reality, it was a wild hen. Here's the crazy part. Multiple years later, when the two friends met again, Zuri's friend asked him if he wanted to eat a wild hen. Zuri said, "Are you kidding? I was solemnly warned by a magician to never eat a wild hen." The friend immediately laughed and said, "Why wouldn't you? You ate the wild hen I served you last time we hung out." Then, according to multiple reports, Zuri started shaking like Fregley after eating too many jelly beans and was dead within 24 hours. To me, this is definitely a mystery, because even when people know that they're going to die, they very rarely just keel over and die out of fear. But because he ended up dying at some point after he ate the wild hen, would that mean that the magician was actually right? Was the magic of the magician just his power to create a self-fulfilling prophecy? Either way, the magician was definitely onto something here. Or he was just some type of ancient version of a YouTube prankster who just sat around all day busting people's balls and protected himself with the imaginary power of his magic. Either way, finding out you unintentionally broke a rule to only die later that day is extremely strange and, to me, terrifying. And the fact that the situation was well documented and never solved is rather curious. Number 6, the disappearance of Emma Filippov. Emma Filippov's disappearance is definitely hard to explain. Neither she nor her explanation have been conclusively found. To be honest, this is quite a sad story. And although there are multiple ways to interpret the story, I'll let you decide at the end. Emma Filipoff was born in 1986 to a family from Ontario, Canada. Her parents divorced at a young age and she was forced to frequently travel to different locations to see her mother and father. Emma was a free spirit. She enjoyed the arts, music, literature, and even took a job teaching English in China for a year as a young adult. After returning from China and unsuccessfully pursuing a career in photojournalism, she landed in British Columbia where she got a summer job working at Redfish Bluefish restaurant while sleeping on a friend's couch. After her seasonal job ended, she bought a van and converted it into a van life style camper. Then one day, for seemingly no reason, she scrubbed her identity on social media clean, removed all traces of herself from the internet, and called off her 3-month-long relationship. Emma also had a journal in which investigators found a lot of entries about how she felt about her parents since their divorce. Through reading the entries, it became apparent that she was having a hard time dealing with the effects the divorce had on her as a child. Emma had a strained relationship with her parents after her father had an affair with a younger woman. Her mother threatened him with a knife, and Emma called the police on her own mother. Records suggest that that was the primary reason that Emma moved out of her parents' house and really didn't want to go back. Personally, I don't blame her. Now, at this point, what's confusing about Emma's story is that she decided to move into a homeless shelter for women, which, if you know anything about homeless shelters, was probably a rougher environment to live in than one of her parents' houses. What's even stranger is at this point when she was living in British Columbia, she had enough money from her restaurant job to rent a decent apartment. But even if she didn't have that money for the apartment, she had an entire renovated van to live in, but apparently she mostly just used it for storage. Now, nobody really knows why she did this, but some theories are that she had undiagnosed paranoia, which made her van feel unsafe. Another possible theory is that she was trying to keep her savings to travel later, which there is some evidence for. Regardless of the fact that she was able to save money at the shelter, Emma was consistently paranoid and anxious at the shelter as well. Staff members allegedly reported that one time she took the furniture and appliances out of her room because they were, quote, telling her things at night. But to be fair, these claims have been contested by others who say that the staff just wanted to portray Emma as a crazy, mentally ill individual in order to alleviate themselves of any personal responsibility. One strange thing about Emma is that it seemed as if she couldn't make her mind up about anything. For example, a couple days before her disappearance, she hired a truck driver to tow her camper van back to Ontario from British Columbia. But the day he showed up, she quickly changed her mind and claimed that she didn't have the money to do it. Then, to make matters stranger, 2 days after this, she called her mother and said she wanted to come home, urgently asking her mom to fly in and come get her. Then, just a couple hours later, she called her mom again to tell her that she changed her mind and wasn't coming home anymore, telling her mom, quote, "I don't know how to face you." Considering how ominous and vague this sentence was, Emma's mother was concerned about her daughter's seemingly erratic behavior, so she booked a flight herself that day to come and help her daughter. After this, her unusual behavior continued. For example, Emma bought a prepaid card with $200 on it and a new prepaid phone, which will tie into the story later. One decision that probably haunts both Emma's mother and the staff of the homeless shelter to this day is that Emma's mother called the women's homeless shelter and decided to let them know that she was going to visit. Then, the staff at the homeless shelter decided to tell Emma about her mother's arrival. Emma was reported to have been, quote, horrified and immediately packed up her belongings and left. Tragically, we'll never know if Emma would have been saved if either of these two decisions were never made. I'm no doctor, but in my armchair psychologist opinion, it seems that Emma possibly had PTSD, which is kind of exemplified by the frequency of her paranoia and the flare-ups of trauma that she experiences involving her parents. But that's just a theory, and I could be completely wrong. Shortly after leaving the shelter, she got in a taxi with her belongings in hand and asked to be taken to the airport, only to change her mind in the middle of the ride, once again lying that she didn't have the money for the taxi. We know this is a lie because she had just received a new credit card, and after working at a restaurant, she had $2,400 in savings, which adjusted for today's money is around $3,300. And everyone knows that that's totally enough money for a taxi, unless you're an oblivious looking tourist in Cancun getting in a taxi with Guadalupe, which at that point, you're done for. And Guadalupe, if you're watching this, please give me my $100 back. That ride from the airport to the hotel was literally like 6 minutes. Anyways, later that night, someone who knew Emma found her walking around barefoot in front of the Empress Hotel. He asked her if she was okay, and she unconvincingly told him that she was just waiting for her friend to pick her up. Dennis, who was Emma's friend, wasn't happy with this answer and thought Emma looked distressed, so he called the police. 20 minutes later, the police arrived and asked her a series of questions. It had been said that she was mostly unresponsive, not saying much and just nodding her head yes and no to the questions asked by the officers. That being said, when it became apparent that the police might take her into custody, she mustered the energy to somehow convince the police that she was totally fine after all. After the police left, she immediately walked away from the hotel area and was never seen again. Now, this case is already weird, but what happened afterwards makes the entire case even more strange. Tragically, her mother showed up to Victoria, British Columbia only 3 hours after she was last seen. And unfortunately, she still thought that Emma would be at the shelter, but the staff told her that they hadn't seen her there that day. When it was confirmed that none of her friends knew where she was declared a missing persons by the police. Remember that $200 prepaid card that Emma had bought? Well, a lead opened up when it was used at a gas station not far away. Unfortunately though, it just turned out to be some random guy who eventually confessed to have found it on the street. Later, another suspect was discovered, a man by the name of Julian Heward, who apparently had a romantic interest in Emma. Strangely though, it was confirmed that he saw Emma at 10 a.m. that day, but like everyone else, he reported Emma to have been acting unusual, because when he asked her what she was doing, she just didn't answer. After all of the leads were exhausted, the case went cold. Then, seemingly randomly, about 2 years after she disappeared, a man in a green shirt with a prosthetic leg was reported to have torn down a missing poster of Emma in a restaurant and thrown it on the floor. Right after doing this, he yelled, quote, "It's one of those missing persons posters, except she is not missing. She's my girlfriend and she ran away because she hates her parents." The staff immediately called the police, who arrived 2 hours later. And to this day, the best possible lead for this case has never been identified. Another interesting piece of the puzzle is that 6 years after her disappearance, a man named William came forward with a confession that after Emma was last seen, he picked her up from the side of the road because it was raining and he wanted to help her. Upon request, he gave her a ride to Colwood, a town that was nearby to the hotel area where she was last seen. William told police that she had requested him to take her there to meet a friend. If this story is true, it would make William the last person to have ever seen Emma, but it also means that Emma didn't go missing in the area of the Empress Hotel, but somewhere in Colwood. Overall, this is a truly sad disappearance and is still currently unsolved. If you have any leads or want to contribute to the search, there's actually still multiple online communities for you to help in, with one of them being Help Find Emma Filipoff on Facebook or r/Find Emma Filipoff on Reddit. With that being said, I hope Emma is found safely soon. I really hate to end this video on such an upsetting note, but I did say this video got scarier as it went on. I guess the silver lining is that there is still hope in the Emma Filipoff case. With that being said, that's going to conclude our first ever video on unsolved mysteries. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the small variety of strange entities, strange occurrences, disappearances, and missing items. How the most notorious serial killers were caught. The year is 1888, and you are located in Whitechapel, England, one of the roughest areas in London's East End. You, like most of the people in your life and in Whitechapel, don't live a life of luxury at all. You struggle to make ends meet, and tonight don't even have the 2 pence to pay for a place to sleep. You used to have a more or less picturesque life until your husband died, and since being on your own, like many women at the time, you resorted to selling your body. Whitechapel wasn't a booming metropolitan area, but it did contain over 62 brothels and over 1,200 prostitutes at the time. So to you, it was a better option than starving. With nowhere else to go, you spent the last few hours at the pub you frequented, and as the pub began to close, the bartender sensed that you weren't able to pay your bill. Unfortunately, they told you tonight it was on the house, as they knew you had fallen onto some tough times. You stumble out of this bar, beyond drunk, into the dark labyrinth that is the Whitechapel streets, and you begin to take the long and ominous walk home. At this time, it had to be at least 2 or 3 in the morning. The street was so dimly lit and the fog was so thick, you could barely see a person standing a few feet in front of you. Luckily, the labyrinth of small roads was something you were more than familiar with and could do with your eyes closed. And while there was nobody on this street beside yourself, you do notice a figure in the distance, something that you knew wasn't typically there. It wasn't a lamppost, and it wasn't an animal. As you get closer, you realize that it's a man in a dark trench coat and tall hat. As your drunken thoughts begin to process what you're looking at, you realize that this man was your golden ticket. You had just possibly found a place to stay tonight and even a way to make a few dollars. And as you approach this man, you try to put yourself together and approach him confidently. You walk right up to him and tell him that if he's looking for a good time, you can both go back to his place, and before you could even finish your offer, you slowly notice this man developing an unnatural smirk. And before you're even fully able to process this unnerving smile, you notice something. The reflection of what streetlight was available twinkled off of an object that this man just pulled out of his pocket, although it wasn't a pocket watch or change. This man had just pulled out a 7-inch knife. You instantly realize you need to run away as soon as possible, but your alcohol-induced delayed reaction time prevented you from taking any action, and the only thing you could do was let out a gasp before this man raises the knife and cuts your existence short. Only a few hours later, at the very crack of dawn, a man is slowly venturing down a cobblestone road when he sees something on the sidewalk. He notices a woman on the sidewalk, although this wasn't the typical Whitechapel homeless person. This was a woman face down, surrounded by blood. This man instantly gets out of his buggy, flips this woman over, only to realize that this woman was not only injured, but brutally murdered. Her neck was stabbed multiple times, and her torso was not only stabbed, but mutilated, with her intestines almost spilling out of her torso. This grim and disgusting discovery was one of the many victims of Jack the Ripper, and the start of a hunt for truth that would last over 137 years. There's no doubt that Jack the Ripper is one of the most notorious, if not the most notorious serial killer of all time. And of course, we're going to discuss exactly how he was caught. But before we discuss how he was caught, it's important to understand exactly how he wasn't caught so long ago. Obviously, technology wasn't nearly advanced as it was now, but that doesn't mean that crimes weren't solved. And in the case of Jack the Ripper, there was plenty of situations where Jack was very close to being caught and truthfully should have been caught. But we'll get to that. One of the biggest factors that consistently contributed to Jack the Ripper being able to go on for so long without being identified was the location of where he lived. As I mentioned earlier, Whitechapel was a rough area. And although it was tight and crowded, people weren't necessarily paying attention to others as they had enough to focus on. And weird things going on weren't so weird there. People shouting in the streets, people sleeping in the streets, people fighting, people with blood on their clothes, all weren't necessarily uncommon in a place where people were struggling to survive, dealing with disease, violence, and crime, and truthfully just trying to make it to their next meal, let alone their own next day. This gave Jack a lot of leeway to commit some truly horrendous crimes as long as he wasn't directly in anybody's eyesight. Another major contributing factor to the reason why he wasn't caught at the time is because he was only active for a few years. Obviously, being an active serial killer for any period of time is unacceptable. However, if you've seen any of our videos on serial killers, you would know that some killers are active for decades. At the time, it wasn't known how long Jack the Ripper was active, as his identity was unknown. Although, with the information that we have now, we can pinpoint exactly when he stopped killing and why he did too. But before we discuss that, let's first discuss how Jack the Ripper even earned a name as a serial killer. This brings us back to our initial story. A woman being found dead in the Whitechapel streets wasn't common, but wasn't unheard of. But what was unheard of was the sheer level of mutilation that occurred on her body. If this happened only once, there would be no Jack the Ripper. But the volume and consistency of these attacks in such a short amount of time were what fueled the media to create a monster, and one of the first ever famous serial killers. In 1888 alone, there is 5 confirmed killings associated with Jack the Ripper. These 5 victims are known as the canonical 5. And the reason these 5 victims are confirmed to be victims of Jack the Ripper are because they all exhibit trademarks of Jack's method of murder. All of these 5 women were either underprivileged, vulnerable, or had recently fallen onto hard times. And most notably, all of these victims had been murdered and brutally mutilated in such a specific manner. But it wasn't mutilation alone that created Jack the Ripper's signature murder. It was how precise and consistent these mutilations were. Coroners and doctors who inspected these victims once they were found would all remark that whoever had done this must have been experienced with a knife in some way, whether they were a doctor or a butcher or a shoemaker. And during the time that these murders were being investigated in the late 1800s, people in those exact professions, among others, were questioned, as whoever was wielding this knife and mutilating these women was no amateur. And that is beyond unsettling. As these murders were first being discovered, people believed that there was multiple murderers on the loose, as people were being killed more than ever, and these murders were happening so close to each other. And for 2 of the canonical 5 victims of Jack the Ripper, they were even murdered in the same night, 45 minutes apart from each other. And for that fact, it's reasonable to assume that it might have been multiple people. However, like I mentioned, the sheer consistency of these mutilations made it hard to believe there was more than one person. And with every murder, the newspaper was feeding more and more into the story that a monster was on the loose. Obviously, the newspapers covered these strange murders to keep locals up to date on what was happening, although some speculate that the newspaper was pushing the story for ulterior motives as well. The name Jack the Ripper didn't come from the police or from the public. It was a name that was referenced in a letter that was sent to the media from somebody claiming to be the murderer. That letter, known as the Dear Boss letter, at that time and until today was considered to be a hoax. However, Jack the Ripper must have gotten word about this hoax and decided to confirm things once and for all, as shortly after the Dear Boss letter was submitted to the media, another letter was submitted to the media, known as the From Hell letter. However, this letter was more convincing, as it wasn't just a written statement from somebody claiming that they were the murderer. It was a letter that stated that it was from the murderer and proved it by including half of a kidney in the letter. This half kidney was from one of the victims of Jack the Ripper. And it was at that point when the newspaper and the general public knew that they had one deranged individual on their hands. And it was also that letter that launched Jack the Ripper from local terror to nationwide and later global infamy. Up until last year, that's basically where the story would have ended. Jack the Ripper was never caught, his identity was never known, and he was somebody that truly terrorized not only his city, but the world. That was until recently. In 2007, a self-proclaimed Jack the Ripper expert named Russell Edwards bought a shawl. But it wasn't any shawl. He wasn't upgrading his wardrobe. He bought a shawl that was believed to have been owned by one of the victims of Jack the Ripper. And not only that, but the shawl was also present at a murder scene and was likely to have DNA on it. And it was this purchase that led to one of the biggest cold cases being solved in almost 150 years. Edwards gave this shawl that he had purchased to a biochemist and tasked him with finding any DNA possible. And that's exactly what he did. And only a few years later, a peer-reviewed article on the DNA analysis that the biochemist was able to find was published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences in 2019. The article that this biochemist published claimed exactly what Russell Edwards had written about all the way back in 2014, that Jack the Ripper was a man named Aaron Kosminski. And while this article has been criticized by scientists for making misassumptions, it does make a pretty compelling case, and at the very least, provides a bit more context to the entire Jack the Ripper situation. Aaron Kosminski was born on September 11th, 1865, in Poland, but emigrated to England in the 1880s. He lived in Whitechapel, in the East End of London, and his occupation was a barber, or hairdresser. That alone is interesting because that confirms that Aaron Kosminski was in the area of the Jack the Ripper killings when they happened, and he also was in a profession that wasn't a stranger to sharp objects. But the information gets deeper. In 1891, Kosminski was institutionalized after he threatened his own sister with a knife. Coincidentally, 1891 was the same year that the suspected Jack the Ripper killings stopped happening. Aaron Kosminski spent the rest of his life institutionalized. And while information about his time in these sanitariums is relatively undocumented, or at least deeply archived, it is documented that he did suffer with severe schizophrenia, leaving him very troubled. Which is also interesting because the things that Jack the Ripper did would, in my opinion, only be the result of somebody who was truly disturbed. But on top of all of these similarities and coincidences, the biggest claim of the article submitted by the biochemist that Russell Edwards had commissioned was that they claimed to have a DNA link between Aaron Kosminski and DNA found on the shawl of the Jack the Ripper victim. It was actually a 100% DNA match. And that piece of evidence alone was the nail in the coffin, and what sparked a lot of the news you likely saw this year of Jack the Ripper's identity finally being revealed. Over the years, there's been a handful of interesting theories about who Jack the Ripper truly was, but I think the argument that it was Aaron Kosminski is definitely the most compelling. But with that being said, was Jack the Ripper ever truly caught? Well, if Aaron Kosminski was Jack the Ripper, then his identity was revealed, which means something. But also, if it was Aaron Kosminski, that does mean that he was institutionalized in 1891 for the rest of his life, meaning that he was imprisoned not for his crimes, but for his illness. His illness that likely sparked these crimes. So although you could argue Jack the Ripper was still not 1000% confirmed, I do think that there is a strong argument that Aaron Kosminski is Jack the Ripper. And for that reason, I do believe he was caught. But even if you don't agree, I think this story is extremely interesting. It adds, if nothing else, new layers to one of the coldest cases in serial killer history. But this is only the first case of 3 that we're covering in this video, so let me summarize. How exactly did Jack the Ripper get caught? According to the evidence we have, he got caught because he was consistently killing. He killed in a very methodical way. He confirmed he was a man acting alone in a letter he wrote to the media. And that letter not only confirmed that he was one person, but also gave the media ammo to create this spectacle that was Jack the Ripper. And it was this spectacle that got him caught. Because if the media didn't make Jack the Ripper the big boogeyman that he was, there would not be Jack the Ripper historians in the modern day. And if there was no Jack the Ripper in the modern day, there would be no collector buying this old shawl that was at the scene of the crime. And there would be nobody to give it to a biochemist to check it for DNA. And it's interesting to think, if Jack the Ripper never had written that letter, would we be talking about him today? And would he have ever been caught? I guess we'll never know. But let's move on. Saturday, August 24th, 1985. You are a 13-year-old boy. and you had just returned home to Southern California from a road trip with your family. The road trip was fun, but the entire time there was an eerie undertone, as your parents and the family you had been visiting out of town were all focused on one subject: the serial killer that had been on the loose in Southern California. You didn't know much of the situation, and truthfully, you weren't too interested, but you overheard your parents talking about some sort of night stalker. And between overhearing your parents and news coverage, it was hard not to have some sort of context about what was going on. And from what you understood, there was this crazy man on the loose who at this point had killed 13 innocent people, and was still not only not caught, but not even identified. This, to you, was scary. But what was about to happen on this fateful night was going to be a lot scarier. You return home from your family vacation later in the night, and you spent the evening unpacking, something that you delayed doing because you were watching your favorite VHS. It was a movie known as Back to the Future, and it only came out a month prior. And watching this movie kept you up later than usual. And this movie left you excited and unable to sleep, which is why you were up at midnight, which for you was later than usual. The rest of your family was sleeping, so you made sure to be quiet and keep to yourself. It was until you realized that you left your favorite pillow in the family RV, and you weren't going to bed without it, so you had to quietly sneak out to it to get it, obviously without waking your parents. You tiptoe outside, and once you make it into the yard, you hear something that sounds like footsteps, but you're not alarmed. You have a large backyard that's unfenced that backs onto a hill, and seeing possums, raccoons, and even deer weren't necessarily uncommon, and you were curious to see what was making all of this noise. You don't see any animal or anything at all, and figure whatever little critter it was must have scurried away. And since you're outside, you figured, why not go to the garage and work on your bike a little bit? Back to the Future got you inspired to tinker around, and maybe you were about to build the first time-traveling bike. And it was shortly into this tinkering session that you once again heard footsteps, but this time it was different. There was no suspicion of this being an animal. You were certain that you were hearing a person walking around the property. Your biggest fear was that your dad was coming out to see what you were up to, but what was actually outside was much more terrifying. It only took a few moments for you to realize that whoever was outside wasn't your dad, because they didn't enter the garage and they didn't say anything. You had an odd feeling and decided to hide behind the car and realized that you couldn't be here. You bolted out of the garage directly into the house, and as soon as you got into the house, you looked out the window to see exactly what was outside. And that's when you see a man walking around your home. You see this man start to walk away, and before he fully leaves your property, you want to get one last look to see if you know who this man could be and what he was doing there. And as you run from your bedroom out through the kitchen to the garage, your dad stops you in the kitchen and asks you, what are you doing? Why are you up at this hour? Hastily, you tell your dad that there's a man in the yard and you need to see who he is and what he's doing now. And after explaining this entire situation in only a matter of seconds, you shove your dad out of the way and run into the yard, when you catch a glimpse of a figure wearing a baseball cap, a jacket, and blue jeans. And although you can't identify this figure, you see them get into an orange Toyota hatchback with a chrome roof rack. As this man got into his car, you run into the road to follow him. And although his car is facing the opposite direction to you, he doesn't just drive off. He does a U-turn in the middle of the road to go the opposite direction. And this gives you the opportunity to see this man's face. The man drove off, and you, confused, go back inside and explain everything to your dad. Concerned, your dad already had the police called, and rather swiftly, the police were at the door taking a written statement. But it was only an hour later when the police called back to get even more information. And then a few hours later, at 6 in the morning, the police once again returned for more information. And the reason why the police returned at 6 in the morning was because only 1.5 miles away from your home, there was another mysterious murder. And it happened only shortly after your initial report was made. And it was at that point when everything had clicked. Initially, you and your parents assumed that there must have been some sort of potential burglar lurking in the yard that was scared away when he saw that people were up. But once the police had confirmed that there was a murder only 1 mile from your home, they suspected that you didn't find a burglar, but that you likely came face to face with Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. 2 days later, on August 27th, 1985, the police identified a vehicle that matched the description that you had given them. It was an orange Toyota hatchback with a chrome roof rack parked on the side of the road. The police had this car towed and impounded, likely to provoke the owner to show up to reclaim it and then to be investigated. When the police towed this car, they asked you, is this the car that you saw that night? And you confirmed it. And the reason why they towed this car initially is because on the night when they took their official statement, you told them that you saw this exact car. And you even remembered the first few digits of the license plate. This alone was a huge breakthrough in the case, and was one of the major turning points that got Richard Ramirez caught. Once the vehicle was confirmed to be the one that they saw that night, police investigated the entire vehicle, finding very little evidence. That was until they found a single fingerprint on the driver's side mirror, a fingerprint that linked the driver of the vehicle to Richard Ramirez. And at that point, a photo and name was submitted to the public as a person of interest. And it was at that point when the floodgates on this case burst open. One day after the name and photo were submitted to the public, on August 31st, 1985, Richard Ramirez was trying to steal a vehicle. And while attempting to steal this vehicle, an altercation broke out. And this altercation got the attention of neighbors. And although Ramirez was able to get car keys from a woman that he had just assaulted, before he could drive away with this vehicle he had attempted to steal, a neighbor had pulled Ramirez out of the vehicle, and other neighbors at this point had also approached the vehicle and began to beat and restrain Ramirez. The police were called, showed up, and arrested the man. And 1 week later, the police called you one final time to identify the person you saw that night in a lineup. You looked at 5 criminals standing beside each other, and you instantly recognized the man who you saw in your backyard. You tell the police that that was the man you saw that night, and it was your testimony that led to the Night Stalker being caught once and for all. The boy in the story that identified Ramirez is known as James Ramiro, and he is truly one brave young man. Not even a young man, he's like 13, he's literally a boy, like a child. And perhaps him being so naive allowed him to have the confidence and the blissful ignorance to follow a mysterious man into your backyard in the middle of the night. As a grown man, I wouldn't do that alone, even if I was armed. Regardless, James being up late that night and deciding to follow this man to the yard ultimately led to the downfall of one of the most notorious serial killers in American history, and undoubtedly saved the lives of innocent people that Richard Ramirez would have victimized next. On September 20th, 1989, Richard Ramirez was convicted of all charges and was sentenced to death. His convictions specifically were 12 counts of first-degree murder, 11 counts of second-degree murder, and 14 counts of first-degree burglary. And although he was on death row, he died on June 7th, 2013 at the age of 53 of lymphoma. I think the story kind of tells itself here. James was an absolute legend of a boy, and Ramirez was a troubled excuse for a man. And although Ramirez was unfortunately able to victimize so many innocent people, justice was at least eventually served, largely in part to James. So exactly how did the Night Stalker get caught? Well, he messed with the wrong boy staying up past his bedtime. The year is 1998. You live in a small town in England known as Hyde, and you have recently been going through some distressing times with your family. Your father-in-law has been experiencing very odd medical symptoms, and it's believed that he may have cancer. Obviously, wanting the best, you and your family decide to go to one of the most respected and well-known doctors in the entire city of Hyde, a man named Harold Shipman. Your father-in-law gets an examination, and a few days later, you call him to follow up on the prognosis. The doctor on the phone rather firmly responds, "I wouldn't buy him any Easter eggs," which was a harsh way of delivering news that someone was going to die soon. Almost eerie, as Easter was only 2 weeks away. Due to the shock of the news you've just received, you appreciate him telling you the truth, and you hang up the phone and begin talking to your family. Your family took this news a little bit softer, as they believed that he was being metaphorical and almost joking, saying that the end was soon, but there was no way that it could have been this soon, right? Regardless, your family started to make the appropriate plans. And almost on cue, only 4 days later after that phone call, even earlier than the doctor had claimed, your father-in-law had passed away. The truth behind his death was a lot more disturbing than simply him succumbing to the disease he had. You meet with the doctor after your father-in-law's passing to discuss if anything could have been done and what really happened and why this was so sudden. And the doctor, rather sternly yet calmly and somewhat compassionately, described to you that sometimes things happen so fast, and realistically in situations with terminal illness, there's not much you can do. This doctor tells you that an autopsy isn't required and that you should plan the funeral as soon as possible to begin the grieving process. And like many others before you, you take his advice and opt to not have an autopsy. This practice was common for Harold Shipman, as he not only advocated for all of his patients who had family members who passed away to not only not get an autopsy, but also to get a cremation as fast as possible. But as you likely already know, these recommendations weren't coming from a place of compassion, but instead out of a place of self-preservation. And the reason why I say this is because Harold Shipman was actively killing his patients. He targeted typically elderly women and sometimes elderly men too, and for the most part victimized people who were already terminally ill and unlikely to be suspected of accidental or intentional death. Harold was a troubled individual, there was no doubt about it. His mother passed away at a young age, and he struggled with drug abuse in his early career as a doctor and was even admitted to a facility. However, it wasn't put on his record and he was only given a warning. This allowed him to continue practicing and even to get his own private practice, which may sound like a fortunate second chance, although that optimism slips away when you realize what happened within his private practice. Harold was no longer addicted to heroin, but he was seemingly addicted to giving his target patients a lethal dose of diamorphine, the same drug that was given to his mother when she was dying. Harold Shipman was suspected of killing his victims as early as 1975, and it wasn't until 1998 when suspicions of foul play began to become overwhelming. As in small communities, word spreads quickly, and it was at that point when Harold Shipman was investigated. Upon investigation, it was confirmed that Harold Shipman's mortality rate as a doctor was 10 times above the average. Yet, when the health authority investigated all of the paperwork associated with these patients and their deaths, they found no irregularities, which at the time lowered suspicion. But as we know now, these papers were actually forged to fit the stories that he was spinning. And while the health authority was investigating the patients, the Greater Manchester Police were investigating Shipman, and unfortunately also failed, as they weren't even able to find his criminal history or the time he spent in an institution for his drug abuse. What this essentially means is that this first investigation into Harold Shipman almost cleared his name. It didn't clear suspicions, but legally speaking, Harold was doing nothing wrong. He was a standard doctor who unfortunately had some unlucky clients. But this story didn't last for long. Only a few months later, on June 24th, 1998, Harold made a very distinct choice that led directly to him being caught. Harold Shipman was at the home of one of his patients, a woman named Kathleen Grundy. This woman was 81 years old and described as being in great health. She had an appointment with Shipman at her home to have a routine blood test, although what she got instead was a lethal dose of diamorphine. As per his standard practice, he quickly wrote her death certificate and stated her cause of death as old age and suggested she be cremated immediately. But that wasn't the only document he forged. Somewhat unusually, he also forged a will, and it was Kathleen's will, giving all of her worldly possessions to her doctor, Harold Shipman. And it was this move specifically that raised more than a few red flags. Kathleen was a former mayor of Hyde, and for that reason was a notable person in the community, and her death was very upsetting to many, particularly her family, who were shocked not only that their healthy mother and grandmother passed away, but also that she'd left all of her money to her doctor. And with that, they began investigating Harold themselves, when they quickly realized that he was behind not only the forgery, but also the death. The family was able to confirm that Harold's fingerprints were on the will that he forged, and that the will was even typed on his typewriter that was missing a key, which undoubtedly confirmed that he was the one who wrote it. And this family somehow was able to find out about Harold's past when the police weren't able to, which at the very least is odd and borderline negligent by the police. Kathleen's family demanded that her body be autopsied, and it was during that autopsy when it was found that she had a lethal dose of diamorphine in her muscle tissue, and Harold Shipman was arrested for the murder of Kathleen Grundy. Once he was arrested, the family of 11 other victims who had their family member buried and not cremated opted to have their family members' bodies examined by the police. And these examinations also showed that these 11 other patients of Harold Shipman were also victims of his. And it was at this time that Harold Shipman was convicted of 15 murders from 1995 to 1998. Although in the investigations that followed his initial conviction, there was over 284 confirmed killings by Harold Shipman. And there are even more that are unconfirmed but likely possible. Just let that sink in. He was only convicted of 15 murders, but he was confirmed to have killed at least 284 of his patients, likely from the years of 1975 to 1998. Harold received life in prison, although only a few years into his sentence, he ended his own life on January 13th, 2004 at the age of 57. Shipman never gave any motive for his murders and never admitted to any of it. These are just 3 cases of how some of the most infamous serial killers were caught. And if you are interested in hearing more, unfortunately, there is more stories to tell. Unfortunate because these stories involve real victims, and I try to be as respectful as possible of that fact.